screens, it's a plot to drop the IQ. Fighting amongst each other over rumors that don't like you. Prefer us trapped in melancholy with the wood ones of holly. Suggestions that obliterate to camouflage the folly. Attempted mental robbery, executed sloppily. The paupers see this mockery and walk the talk with me. Put the hands up to touch the akasha, cause you know deep down there's something bigger than your wallet.
Sweet eternal balance of all that is good, true, and beautiful, friends. My guest today goes by the moniker of the Great Baldini and has lived a life of exploration, intrigue, and insider understandings of the machinations of the maniacal system underneath which we are burdened. He has seen into the darkness of the algorithms that run our world and watched as they seem to destroy humanity, intellect, and culture. Working in applied physics and audio engineering and hailing from my own stomping grounds of the Pacific Northwest, the Great Baldini will sweep you away with his amiable wit and cutting insight, and we are so excited to have him here. Baldini, welcome to Rogue Ways.
Oh, thanks for having me. I was worried I was on the wrong show for a minute.
Where am I?
Were you expecting another guest? Did I get Rouge Ways? Is this one of those makeup?
Yeah.
Okay.
I love that when people spell it Rouge Ways. I'm like, okay, maybe I'll start selling makeup soon. We'll see.
No, thanks for being so accommodating to my very awkward and strange schedule, and you've been super great about that. So thanks.
Oh, right back at you. Awesome. All right, well, before we get started today, let me remind everyone that you can find my memoir, my fictional novel, my poetry, my articles, my photography, and even an offering of tarot readings and life guidance on my site at www.rogueways.org. And you're also welcome to come check out the Facebook group Eyes Open, where we like to collaborate and hang out with people who are open-minded and open-hearted. So come connect with us there as well. And now we'll start with the traditional Rogue Ways method of asking you a pointless question, Baldini.
Perfect.
If you could travel in any method that you can imagine, what would be your ideal method of movement between locales?
Teleportation.
Wow, instantly. You just know it already.
Probably wasn't a question. I mean, yeah, if I could travel in anything, it shortens the distance. I mean, I love traveling as a way to increase my insight into places around the world. I love immersion travel, right?
Yeah.
So I don't bring my culture with me. I want to immerse myself in there. But if I could teleport and be instantly there, then that would open up. Time would be of lesser import. I could go anywhere I wanted at any time. Yeah.
That's a really good point. I didn't even think of it because I always think of just like how much I hate flying and how I wish that instead I could just be like enveloped in like a fluffy cloud of some sort of material and just like float through the sky by myself instead of with like 100 other people who are sneezing and coughing and farting.
Yeah. Well, that's one of in fact, that's travel is one of the things on my wife and I's bucket list is taking the great train routes. So as a younger person, I did Eurail through Europe, and but there is the Trans-Siberian Express and also the one that goes across to Canada. And so we'd
What's
love
the
to.
Canadian one? I've never even.
I can't even remember the name of it, but there is one that goes coast to coast.
East-west?
Yep,
Nice.
goes all the way across, and that would be. I've seen photographs. It's quite beautiful, and the Trans-Siberian one is like 1,800 miles, close to 2,100 miles. It's ridiculous. So that would be just really excellent. And I don't know if you've traveled by train or any more than like commuter train, but any kind of sort of luxury, or if you have accommodations and you have a sleeping car, it is the way to go. There's no other way that I would prefer, but teleportation, that would also screw with people's heads when you showed up.
It'd be so nice to just be able to jump to like China or something and not have an 18-hour flight or whatnot.
Yes. Yeah,
That'd
those Asian flights are brutal.
I do love the idea of the train because then you get to see the views and have the comfort, like you said, of the sleeping cart. And now I'm going to look into that more and see if I can finagle me a train ride somewhere.
You should.
Sounds
You
cool.
should. I highly recommend it to anybody who hasn't. And a few of my friends that that were coming to visit me in Seattle from California said, "Oh, take the Coast Starlight," and they found it was reasonably priced, and everyone fell in love with it. I mean, there's the sort of gentle rocking motion of the train, and it goes at a pretty good clip. There are quite a few stops, but you get to know your fellow passengers, and you eat in the dining car, and you get to see all the things that you never look at while you're driving.
Yes.
So it's a wonderful experience, and I recommend it.
I've done the train from Southern Oregon up to Seattle. And that's also beautiful because you get a lot of coastal views, a lot of water views, a lot of forests and mountains and waterfalls. And it's lovely. And it is pretty affordable, although I feel like it's getting more expensive, not because more people want to do it, but because less trains are offering services, perhaps, or
There
I'm
is
not
less,
sure.
yeah, less trains offering services, and they, Amtrak is the primary U.S. rail carrier, and they're subsidized by the government. So when that all, changes and funding
Comes
is,
falling down.
yes, it just becomes weirder. But there certainly is a lot more personal space than you would get on a flight, especially these
Exactly.
days. It smells a lot better than a bus.
Yeah.
Most things
Definitely.
do.
Yes.
I've been in porta potties that smell better than a bus, but
For real. What is that? I like quit smoking one time and I was like, oh, you can smell so much more when you quit smoking. I can smell flowers and all these things, and it's such a blessing. And then I got on a public bus and I was like, sometimes it's a curse though. Like
yeah,
so bad no matter what happens. And I'm not sure why it has to be that way.
that is to some degree true with any form of when you're really observant. It's like the old Jackson Brown song "Doctor My Eyes" comes to mind, right? You're like, oh man, maybe I should get some blinders on. This is
Good point. Yeah.
this is ridiculous, right? So, and the only other option is to not look, and that's worse. So I can't go around
True.
blind.
Yeah, it's like the pain comes with the pleasure. You have to go through it to get to the goodness. In fact,
Yep.
we were talking a little bit before we started recording about how, when you're healing from something traumatic, it's actually really, really painful to do so. But like the hope is that when you get past that, it's more pleasurable. Your life is better.
Sure, and that most people aren't motivated to do so unless the perceived pain of the change itself, is less than the pain of not doing so. So that if you're stuck in, a repeating cycle of less than premium quality results from your choices, once you finally get, like I said, 12 steppers would call that hitting rock bottom, right? That until the place where you are is more painful than the perceived pain of change, most people aren't likely to. And the same is in similar ways true to waking up to the deception of the world around you. It's a painful process. There's almost everybody I've observed goes through a grieving process of there's almost exactly the steps. There's this denial. They get angry, right? They get mad. They grieve the things they lost and the loss of the worldview. Then they start losing friends, and relationships become strained because they try to wake other people up who don't want to have anything to do with it. So almost everybody there's almost no one that I've seen that really has woken up fully, who hasn't gone through a very kind of a trauma, right? There is kind of a trauma to it,
It
but
is a trauma, yeah.
yeah, but it's certainly worth it. Again, for me, I couldn't bear the burden of not being intellectually honest and intentionally ignoring the truth. I just can't do it. I've never been able to do that.
Yeah, well, I'm with you. And I think like the motivating factor for me is once you see like, wait, we could be doing this all so much better. Like, why are we doing this way? Like you have
Sure.
I at least have to try to get us closer to that, next 7 generations and all that.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, and for me, I mean, one of the things about just the nature of me, I don't know if you're familiar with like the Myers-Briggs thing, and I don't put a
Yeah.
whole lot of weight in anything, but
it
yeah.
often tends to be very, I don't know, accurate, I
Semi-accurate.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in a similar way to like astrology,
You can change.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I have. I went from ENFP, right, as a young person, and now I'm INTJ, which is very. But one of the things about that is that I get a literal physical sense of discomfiture if I can't make sense of things, right? So what we would call sense making, if things don't jibe, if there's something that feels wrong, until I understand what's going on, and I've always really had a sense of that I can't sleep. I get distracted. I will constantly focus on a thing until I can figure it out. And once you get to the depth of the rabbit hole that many of us have, where you realize that it is the history of mankind has been occluded and destroyed. Almost everything that's around us is a lie to some degree or another, and because it is almost implausible that we will ever really know the truth. And I had to come to terms with that and acquiesce to the idea that the best I can do is come to a place of just, again, acquiescence and peace with the fact that the views that I have now, I accept them as it's the most plausible answer based on the information that I have. But since there is this dearth of information, I have to accept that I'm almost certainly wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I have to just come to peace with that and go. And so it also affects the way that I approach conversations, and especially people that get hot and bothered on social media or forums, especially even truth seekers. They get
They get
very
like committed to some perception that's like,
yes,
maybe that's
some
right. Why
idea,
are you
some
so
hypothesis.
committed to
Yeah,
it? Yeah.
yeah, they get some conjecture that they really married to, and then they bag everybody else for being stupid or whatever, that they can't accept their truth. And I have a
Right.
big problem with that whole saying, speak your truth. I'm like, well, that's not objective truth. That's your perception, and that's almost
Speak
certainly
your
not.
opinion.
Yeah, exactly. Speak your. That's fine. You're
Yeah.
entitled to have your opinion, and I respect that. And so
But
I
it's
don't.
nice when your opinion comes with, some evidence to back it up and some open-mindedness that there might be evidence you haven't seen yet.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That is exactly right. And so that's why I remain open-minded and go, hey, I always reserve the right to be wrong.
Yeah.
I assume that I am, but so far I have enough evidence to go on that I'm comfortable with the views that I have. And in some places, I just have to say, fuck, man, I don't know. Right?
Right.
What's the shape of the earth? I don't know. I'm a
I don't know.
geometric agnostic. I don't know. It looks to me to be observably. I can't find any curvature. I can't find any.
No.
I can't find any evidence of motion. There's all, without getting too far into that, but from what my senses tell me, I'm not going to ignore my senses based on some mathematical bullshit that I can figure out quickly myself that doesn't
And from
add up.
the Church of the White Coat telling you
Yes,
what to think.
exactly. Yep, the priest of the white coat. And so, I don't buy it. So anyway, I just say, but in truth, I don't know, right? I can't prove anything, and I'm comfortable again with not knowing. I just have to accept that I don't know, and I probably won't. But the premise that I have right now and what it looks like a dual toroidal field with the inertial accretion disk in the center, and the way that all
Yeah.
works. I mean, I have a model in my head that works.
Yeah.
But does that mean it's right? No. Would I go defend it? I can't. I mean, I can go, this is the best. This makes the most sense, and it's consistent with the physical laws of nature that I'm familiar with, and I'm kind of a let's say autodidactic polymath. I mostly self-taught. I mean, I've taken collegiate level courses on a lot of things, but have gotten to a level in academia, at least understanding. I can look at almost any field, and within a couple of weeks I can become pretty conversant in it, right? And so I can say that largely almost any field of discipline, it almost always comes down to they choose nomenclature that is intentionally occlusive. They sort of ostracize people and assume that you will get so far and go, well, I don't trust you guys, you're smart. But they always get to a place where it always comes down to this. In a process we don't fully understand, it all goes fractal at some point, right? So to that degree, again, I don't buy the priest, the white lab coat guys. Most of their stuff is nonsense, and demonstrably so. But they are counting on people to not look very far, just give up and accept the authority. And we're taught that way. I mean, you know this. You're a teacher, right?
Right.
They reward acceptance of the narrative, and anybody that asks questions instead of rewarding that, that's strongly discouraged. And
It's mocked.
it's not, yeah, it's mocked. And I mean, I actually got in trouble. I mean, again, I graduated high school in 1985, so quite a long time ago. And even then, I got in all kinds of trouble for asking very pertinent questions that challenged the status quo and said, this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. And they're like, yeah, but that's the way it is. In fact, they would sometimes go, we agree, it doesn't work, but that's how it is. And
But we're moving on now.
exactly.
Well, and it's because the people who are reinforcing this aren't necessarily in on some lie or some agenda. They're not like me and every other teacher I know weren't like, okay, I want to go enforce this conformity and this, this inability to ask questions, and I want to like mold everyone to the same way. That's not what people are doing, but people have been trained to identify with their perceived authority and status and the ideas that go with that and the ideas that they're teaching. And so when someone questions it, it's like teachers just respond out of this perceived attack to their identity and take it as this, affront, when really it's like a beautiful thing to ask a question. You should love it.
And you're challenging my authority, and we can't have that. And
Right.
that is part of the, the societal programming that we've received is to that we're
Mhm.
supposed to respond to authority with again, sort of kowtowing and acquiescent to their authority, and that's exactly the wrong thing to do, because I was discussing this, in fact, with Jason and Crow not too long ago, of how this idea that people's response about, well, what do you mean everybody's lying? Almost nobody, to their knowledge, is lying. They're
Right.
sincerely wrong. And
Yes.
the further they're invested in it, right? So I will often say that the higher the education, the deeper the indoctrination,
Definitely.
and because you once you are invested in something, then you must defend it, right? And so you go, but I know this stuff, right? These are the things I know. I know astronomy, I know physics, I know these things, and so if you challenge it, I'm going to say that you just don't understand. You're stupid, and
Right.
they can't bring themselves to look at the elephant in the room, right? So because that, again, it
It starts
strips
to
them.
crumble.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. It strips them of the accolades, and they're both deeply invested in time and finances, right? Because it costs money to go to school, to invest a little bit
Right.
more, and so the more deeply you're invested, the more you have to lose, and just nobody's gonna risk that, and they simply can't. And I find it over and over again. For example, in paleontology and archaeology, that when people legitimately find things that goes against the narrative, which is all the time, they get run right out of the industry immediately. Like
Yeah.
you will accept that that goes against our narrative, and it can't be. No, but it is. But it can't be. So
Can't be, so it's not.
it's not
How
exactly.
convenient.
Yeah, how convenient. So very few people have the temerity to really stand up and to risk everything for
Right.
intellectual honesty, and that's really, I think, where the truth seekers, and that's why I have a great deal of respect for people like Crow and Dearth and a bunch of guys who were willing to take the heat and the mockery and all the stuff that comes with it to speak, again, their opinion, not the truth, but
Right.
their opinion, and take those
Their
hits and say
perceptions.
exactly, and risk professional, their professional stuff, and to say, I mean, to a degree, even that's why, again, with the moniker the Great Baldini, it's been an industry nickname for me for a long time. But
Love it.
I'm self-employed, and so I have some clients that are very serious, right? So
Right.
at this point, I just simply can't risk. I don't take any extraordinary measures to hide my real identity, but I can't go blathering it about either,
Yeah.
because
You can't just be
people,
public and loud and
sure, the
yeah.
first thing people want to do is dox you and embarrass you, right?
Mhm.
And so, and that's, again, we find this over and over, that anybody who asks the question, right, an uncomfortable question, the first thing that they do is they mock them, denigrate them, ostracize them, and to me, that should be, for anybody, the first red flag, I'm fond of saying that truth does not fear investigation or skepticism, right, at all. In fact,
Right. You
it
should
would
love it.
invite, yes, it invites investigation, because that simply confirms the truth. And so any question that is immediately met with hostility, or an attempt to ostracize or mock it, should be of its own accord, prima facie, should be just on the face of it, something you should consider investigating. Doesn't matter how crazy it is. In fact, the crazier it sounds to you, there's probably a reason it sounds crazy. Right. So because you have been so programmed and indoctrinated, I think people just don't
Yes.
realize the level of indoctrination that we have been provided since day one. And so we all conform to it because we were told that's what it means to be a good person, right? To respect authority, to love, to have Stockholm syndrome, to love your captors, to
Yeah.
love the police and the military. And again, I don't hate any person individually, but the
No.
system as it's set up is designed in such a way that the only protecting and serving that they're doing is the protecting and serving of the authority, right? So
Unless they're amazingly lucky to be in a place where they're not, because people who are in that system, again, who try to shake it in any way or act any other way, get pushed out,
yeah, exactly.
just like with science.
Exactly. And so I will say that I have very little respect for people who do it long term, because as soon as
Yeah.
you're there, if you realize what the score is, and you don't do anything about it, then you are compromised, right? And so
Yes.
most compromise does come as a slippery slope. Most people don't start out eating babies, right?
Right.
I mean, but they do, make a choice to compromise a little bit, and then once they're compromised, I mean, this is the standard ploy of every secret society and the mafia, right? Is that they give you something that is desirable to you, and it's on the down low, whether that's drugs, alcohol, sex, whatever. But they now have something over you. They've got blackmail material, so you're compromised. And so once everybody's mutually compromised with mutual imprecations, then nobody can get out. And then at each step, they need a little bit more until you're doing things that you never would have considered previously. But now it's no big thing, because once the more deeply you're in, you're there. And in fact, it's again similar, I suppose, to those of us on the other side, on the truth movement. The further down the rabbit hole you get, there's no way you can see things in the way that you once did. You can't look at movies or television or popular culture of any kind, or news or anything, without and see it the way you once did. You simply can't. So it's a slippery slope. I mean, the person's character in any aspect is a cumulative result of prior decisions.
Right.
So
yeah, we're trained in and out of it. I really appreciate the work of Rupert Sheldrake, and he has a book called The Science Delusion, and he goes through the sort of ways that it when you look at it, it becomes obvious that science is a religion.
Self-reinforcing, yes.
Yeah,
yes,
like a cult.
It's more than a religion, it is a cult, yes. And
it's exactly like you said, any evidence that doesn't match the expected norm in any field, it's not just one, it's every single field that exists is literally thrown out and ignored. Unless enough people, like you were saying, are kind of like brave enough and have enough character to keep pushing it long enough that enough people have to look at it that it becomes accepted, and then
it becomes
things change.
Noisy enough. Yep.
But it's so slow, and it ignores so much. And so when people think like, oh, well, it's scientifically proven. I mean, and I even say that. I'm like, oh, science has shown, what I don't like, I'm like you, I don't take that as like the ultimate end. I'm just like, here's a piece of evidence that could show us something,
Sure.
But yeah, it's interesting when people think that, and it's actually like one of the least has like the least integrity, perhaps, of, I don't know. It's just a very
of almost anything, and
yeah.
More and more, I see the same things in, again, the far left culture. I mean, we could probably at some point a good way to segue into the topics we're going to cover in terms of language, but how twisting of language, like the far left calls themselves progressive, meaning that anything that's not them is regressive, right? Backwards. So it's
such a trick.
it is a trick, exactly.
And you don't see it necessarily when you're just like, yeah, I'm progressive. I like to move forward with things and get better. And you're
exactly.
Like, but it's sort of to buy into.
It's sort of a parlor trick that I've been able to do over the last several months, is that when if somebody will tell me two things that they think are important, I can give them the entire list of 25 things that how they view life.
Nice.
And it's not because I'm psychic, it's although I'm something of an empath, but it has nothing to do with that. It's because the program that we're given is so rigid that you cannot be a heretic. You cannot go against your own cult. So for the far left, you're
just reading from like the party line,
the script, that's
book,
right.
Yeah,
and you cannot divert from that in any way, or you're going to become an outcast, right? So so whether that's the politically the far left or the far right, or again, even within some aspects of the quote truth movement, I don't like the labels, they're for soup cans, but certainly there is the far left, and that's becoming again more mainstream, because that's what the media is pushing, so that those things become normalized in the Overton window and what's become acceptable, but nobody is allowed to stray from those, right? So for example, you take the far right, so there's nobody in a far right hardcore Christian camp could be pro-choice, right? Because you can't
allowed.
Right, it's not allowed. And on the on the far left, nobody can be for Second Amendment gun rights, right? Because you can't break from the script. So I can run down a list of here's 20 things that you also accept, right? Because you gave me two, and so just all I need is two, and I can go through the whole list. And people get angry with that, right? With even
they don't want to be that predictable.
They don't want to be that predictable, and the thing is, and again, this kind of goes back to a conversation I had early on with Crow and Jason on his show. It is that we. Oh, by the way, for listeners who wonder why I keep referencing, that's a mutual friend. So that's kind of how I get introduced to Lindsay. So that's kind of the tangent point. But anyway, in talking about using AI and metadata to predict what people's behaviors and to drive behaviors, is that people are far less spontaneous than they imagine. that we're programmed and we run on those programs. And then when people become triggered, there's a reason for that. It's because there's a trigger embedded. And so you respond a certain way. So if somebody says to you, oh, hey, the earth might be flat, you get mad, right? So they don't go, what? They immediately get angry. Well, that's a really weird response to that. That's just it's a phenomenally strange response, right?
To be angry at someone's opinion about something that doesn't actually matter, or like doesn't affect you at all.
Just shouldn't affect them at all, right? They should go, well, are you okay? Is everything okay at home?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that should be your kind of response. Going, Fred, is everything okay? If you think that's crazy, right? But you're told it's crazy. It's not even like, well, what would make you think that? They immediately shut down, and I can watch their eyes glaze over. I can watch their temples start to throb. It is a remarkable response, and certainly that should indicate that there's something going on in there. I mean, again, we were talking before the show how for a period of time I did substance abuse and anger management counseling in Northern California as a counselor, not getting counseled, just to clarify there. But the way people perceive things is. Oh, well, it's I'm kind of dodging down a rabbit hole here, but the way that they look at things.
The conditioning that you're talking about and how early it starts, right?
Yes, yeah. So once you build up this wall of perception, right, and you're not able, everyone has a myopic view that is self-blind, everyone, right? And so, and most people cannot really, they have a really difficult time being honest about the places that they have those troubles, right? And so they're unlikely to correct or fix it, and very few people can even take responsibility for the results of their own actions. Most people will complain when things go bad. I'm so sad because my bank account is empty. Well, let's go look at where you spent your money. You spent $400 last month at Starbucks. Shut up. You don't know.
They have responses instantly attack. Anything that will point out your flaws.
Sure, they get defensive, right? So that immediate defensive response, and here's the I guess the takeaway here is that I learned for myself in my own self-improvement, right, is that anytime that my response was of a greater emotional level than what the stimulus was, right? So if I would get really angry really quickly at somebody or frustrated, I had to acknowledge that was in me, right? It wasn't the external stimulus. It was actually within me that was causing that. And so I had to go look for the trigger point and then, hopefully diffuse it. And so you pull those landmines out, and it's made me a much, I would say, better person. But the very fact that that's there should be an indicator that when you see a news article or you see, if has to be a trigger warning on something, that's in you. And somebody's probably put that there on purpose, right? That's probably artificially placed because you probably have no experience personally with being shot at or, terrorism or anything like that. It's only, sort of extemporaneous and by proxy through the news, right? They've created a fear paradigm. So you're afraid of everything that's not ever likely to ever happen to you. So you get this trigger thing. And so people have been triggered by something that is, again, artificially placed. And that should be a red flag that if you're behaving in a way that's inconsistent with your surroundings, that should be an indicator that there's something deeper you should look at.
Which is literally mind control. It's not like we don't have to parse words. Like that's what's happened. You've been conditioned to the point that your mind is controlled and your emotions are controlled.
That is correct. I mean, the level I look at it now is that one of the things I find in my study, for example, on I was fascinated, for example, we've had this conversation among several people about why some people wake up and why some people don't. Right. Yeah. And it does seem fairly curious. And again, having conversation with different people, Jason had one idea about musicians, right? Or artistic people seem to be a little bit more prone to waking up. Crow had mentioned that he noticed that people who woke up were often pot smokers, right? And that they saw things differently. I thought, well, that is curious, right? That they have a different view of things. So maybe they might be less prone to, they might have, issues with authority or something like that. But as I look more closely into it and go back a little bit further, one of the things that struck me is, again, listening to the discourses of Aldous Huxley, for example, the author of Brave New World and other things.
Doors of Perception.
Yes, and from which the band The Doors got their name. He was definitely a brilliant man, but he was also quite narcissistic, and he led a lot, and he abused drugs. used, abused, however you see. Again, there's even a word that sort of
Right.
abuse. Well, again, I have issues with that, right? Because I mean, here's just a quick interjection. One of the things that society has said that anybody who uses, let's say, a hallucinogen or any of those things that might open your eyes to the doors of perception is somehow a moral turpitude, right? That it's somehow bad and wrong. And so, why is that?
Yeah.
Right. So why should exploration
Of your
into
own consciousness.
yes,
Yeah.
why should that be verboten? And that is a very fascinating key feature of society to me that they have outlawed those things, right? So
Because
again,
it'd be one thing if it was just cautioned, like if you do this, this could happen. If you do, these are the possible dangers, so be careful, don't take it lightly, like all those things, that makes sense. But to straight out say like don't and you're bad if you do.
sure. And one of the
Weird.
things that one of the drugs that we know causes obstruction there. Alcohol is instead
Just
encouraged and
have as
socially
much as you
acceptable.
want.
Yep, as
Yeah.
much as you want, despite the very obvious destruction that it causes in people's lives when they overdo it. So
Immediately and long term, both.
sure.
Yeah.
So again, they encourage the things that are harmful and
Hmm.
discourage anything that might give you an inkling
Mm.
into what's going on,
Might
right?
break
So
you free.
sure. So in any
Aldous
case, so
Huxley.
yeah, yeah. So I was just getting back there. So Aldous Huxley, uh, he would let things slip. So my view on it is that him and Orwell and a bunch of these guys, again, we talk about how prescient they were about
Mm.
1984 being, wow, they foresaw the future. I just don't think so. I think it, especially the letters that were exchanged between them, when you read them, it seems pretty clear to me that they were assigned to draft a picture of what a society, an authoritarian society, would look like that people would accept,
Mm.
right? So
Or like,
and how
yeah,
might
or at
we
least
get
how
there?
to use like human structure against ourselves to
Sure, and
make that
how
happen.
might
Yeah.
we get there, right? And so Huxley preferred the drug approach, right? So
It's like Orwell was like the stick approach and Huxley was like the carrot approach,
exactly.
right?
I mean,
Yeah.
almost exactly. And Huxley took Orwell to task with that specifically, saying the boot on the neck will work, but only for a time. People will resist that, right?
Yeah.
Whereas he created this magical drug, Soma, that would a lot of it would be like a hallucinogen, and a little bit just sort of like a little happiness and complacency. And he was fascinated with it, and you can tell when you watch closely his conversations that he even in the things he would say, we have to be careful about these things coming and we have to be on our guard against this sort of thing. He was delighted by the idea. He was
Mm.
giddy.
Yeah.
And so, but one of the things that I noticed with him, again, Orwell, if you listen to some of his lectures, Marshall McLuhan is fascinating, but he's also, again, Jesuit trained. And so I
Mm.
noticed to me that, is compromised and
Yeah.
all of them will, from time to time, you can tell that they stop and then will suddenly use double speak and back up and say, oh, but that's a bad thing. Or
Mm.
they'll interject something that just is completely out of context and makes no sense, but pushes a narrative. McLuhan did that with the whole space thing. He would throw that in there just randomly. It's like, where did that come from? So
Mm.
again, I just kind of go, yes, he sort of stopped, and then he would actually, like I'm doing, sort of sidetrack himself a little bit. But
Yeah.
all this to get back to this. So these ideas here is that when you go back far enough, and Huxley mentioned it as well as McLuhan mentioned it, but they were, McLuhan, for example, spoke specifically on the impact of electronic media on society,
Yeah.
and
That
sort
was
of
fascinating.
the dangers of it, as well as how it might fit in. But what
And
Huxley
so
would talk,
did
sorry,
Orwell, right? Because he's
yep,
talking about how you can modify any text and any
yeah.
video and any of this stuff with their whatever machines they were
Yes.
using in
Okay.
that book.
So,
Yeah.
specifically, Huxley and McLuhan spoke of beginning in the mid 19th century. There was a lot of initial work into mesmerism and the ideas what we would now call hypnosis and the power of
Yeah.
suggestion. And there was, again, from the hardcore material sciences, they pushed back on this and did not want it to be real. And
Do you
Huxley.
think? Do you think that's because they didn't want people to know that they could control people in that way, or because they just actually wanted to be more materialist than that?
I think both.
Maybe both.
So again, if you go to the idea of this pyramidal structure and kind of what we talked about before, are people lying or are they deceived? I think 99% are deceived. Only a very, very few have even a clue of what's going on. And so once everybody accepts it, that's the party line, and you cannot deviate from that. And you're certainly not going to go any further. If you do, you're pushing a rock uphill, like Sisyphus, right? So you're never gonna complete your task. So early on, when mesmerism was looked into, for example, before anesthesia and surgery, it actually had enormous positive results. And Huxley even quotes material sciences and scientists, in one of the leading guys of the day, saying, even if it were proven to be true, and this is the idea, if there's consciousness outside the body, apart from the body, and sort of because they felt like mesmerism was a little too woo, and then we're getting into the ideas of philosophy, and then we're talking about a soul, right? And so it made them all very uncomfortable. And I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head, but basically he said, even if it were proven to be true, we should do all that we can to suppress it. In fact, especially if it were true, because it would basically destroy our house of cards. People would lose faith in science. If it were discovered that there was this woo thing. It's fascinating. So, but anyway, the idea here, and this is where just go back to the previous idea, that this kind of the overarching thought is, why do some people wake up and not? And so as Huxley was describing that, as they looked into mesmerism and the idea of suggestibility and hypnosis, that it follows pretty much the Pareto curve, which is 80-20. So you get 20% on either end. Some are very suggestible, some are not suggestible whatsoever. And then in the middle, you get the standard bell curve, right? So because it goes along that field. And so, and then in the 1930s to the 1950s, they were, the government, whoever those guys, the alphabet agencies, were trying to make a super soldier, and so they were trying to use ideas, and they were working even prior to World War II with some of the Nazi scientists to try to use mind control techniques. What eventually became MK Ultra after the war, and worked on all this stuff, was to make a super soldier who was fully aware and but didn't have any compunction about killing and do all this stuff. And so again, the results were that you would get a slight number on either end, 5% or so, that were you get those who took immensely well and they became the thing, and you get a 5% that were total washouts. They would fracture and attempt suicide, that sort of stuff. And again, this bell curve in the middle, but they have found that they could continue, they could get better results by using a battery of different things. So everything from sensory deprivation to repeating things to all kinds of peer pressure and that sort of stuff. So they could get a much better result and push their numbers much higher if they did these things. So what I find is that as I do some observations and really look really closely into this, and so, like, for example, the cathode ray tube, which is what a television is, a CRT monitor, right, was invented actually in like 1863. Television in 1863. They didn't have a means of transmission wirelessly. That took until Samuel Morse and Tesla and those guys did some wireless transmission, but they actually had the premise for the cathode ray tube as early as 1863, prior to the Civil War. But early on, it was discovered that people would go into an alpha wave state, because what you're in a different prospect in film, for example, when you watch a film, it's a light projected through celluloid, and then it's reflected off a surface just like anything else. There's light coming back into your eyes, and so you perceive it in a way similar to the way you would the natural world. With a cathode ray tube, the light actually goes through it and into your eyes, and you become an active participant. And what it does is it makes your eye muscles, who are constantly going, and it's sort of a natural gyroscope. You'll find if you turn your head and bob up and down, you don't sense the same sort of thing that if you hold a camera like a phone and wobble it around, it'll make you sick. Well, you don't get that. It's self-stabilizing, right? You have this internal gyroscope, and your head always wants to tilt up. So as a television causes you to become an active participant, to put those rasters back together, and so it immediately puts you into a hypnotic alpha wave state. You become immediately suggestible, and that's how they selected the flicker rate. The flicker rate was initially set at 60 hertz, and so
isn't that the same rate that fire flickers at?
Yeah, and also what we use our North America, our power is done at 60 cycles per second. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. So, but all that to get here is that it's intentionally done. They knew from the outset that this was going to be a form of easy to easily manipulate you and put you into a suggestible state. And so one of the things that I again find fascinating is that up until up until about the late 60s, this was still part of the academic and philosophical conversation, is these ideas of thought, philosophy was initially, again, philo, love, Sophie, knowledge, wisdom, the love of wisdom. Philosophy covered all of the natural sciences, covered everything. And now it's been pushed out as like,
like foo-foo.
yeah, so as I like to say, what does the color 13 taste like? Right?
Yeah.
It's a nonsensical, why am I here? Sort of, these are unanswerable questions, and forget about that. But really, philosophy, again, when you look at all the material sciences, all comes back to our perception of the world, right? So you go back to the alchemical stuff, all is mind, right? So everything that we perceive, even as a material reality, is actually our interpretation of it. And it all goes through the limbic system, is interpreted in such a way that we kind of piece it back together to make our own reality. And so we have this internal dialogue and internal view. But anyway, the idea here is that these conversations were had at medium to high levels of academia. You didn't go into college without studying some level of philosophy, without reading the classics, and suddenly it stopped. Right about the time that they hit a saturation point of televisions being in homes. Once they got past about 60% of U.S. households having a television set, that conversation immediately stopped.
Wow.
And the programming, the style of programming began to change. What you see is that early television programs were a lot of game shows and infotainment, you might call it. There was a lot of news programs. And then suddenly you had, in fact, the dividing line there right at 1970, several popular television shows like Green Acres and things that had a more rural setting all got stopped. Even popular shows, they just all got canceled, and everything suddenly went into city life. They began moving and migrating populations to the city, and that was the hip new way of society. They stopped these conversations and pretty much, in my view, didn't want anybody to think or talk about it. So all of McLuhan's postulations in his iconic book, The Medium is the Message, again, you couldn't study communication or journalism in my day without, that was the first book you read, right? Now these ideas of what is the impact of these media on how we think and how we approach society, that conversation has all but ended.
Yeah.
And I find that to be not, again, not organic, right? So it's not simply that we became stupid. And again, McLuhan pointed out that those who had grown up in an era prior to electronic media, in fact, those before radio, so anybody prior to, say, 1910 or so, and had learned to become literate, read and write, had a very different neuroplasticity. It was already sort of set that they thought in different ways than those who grew up with radio, the electronic media, where they could just sort of shut down and listen. And so early radio was a lot of theatrical stuff, right? The shadow, all these things. And so it was sort of theater of the mind. But those who grew up in an era prior to that, if you know Edward Bernays and the father of public relations and really, again, mass media mind control, they determined that that group was a total wash. They were not going to be easily programmed, that they had to grow up with electronic media. And it was by an order of magnitude more of people who grew up with, that they became literate prior to watching television and afterwards. They were unable to have an attention span long enough to really do long-term reading and to really ponder questions. And now the attention span, people are, kids are, babies are playing with devices and such that they literally don't have the eye muscle control to read for long periods of time. And they can never ponder deeper questions because they don't have an attention span longer than a goldfish, really. So it is, it's not only frightening, but it is devious and it is wanton and done intentionally. There's no doubt in my mind you don't get here, without it being intentional. So again, this overarching stuff, and again, to me, this is all sort of tied into the idea of linguistics and how we got here, and
Yeah.
they killed Latin on purpose, and sort of what English is, and how the mind develops around ideas linguistically, and the way
Yes.
we think. So. Yeah.
I want to also, though, quickly touch on this idea when you're saying they changed the programming from sort of rural to urban, and and even if we look at like radio and the types of programming they had, and then what it switched to, it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe more about this, but it seems when radio was the thing that you had this sort of, your imagination is engaged, you're listening, but you're mostly, imagining this in your mind as it's playing out, and you have, I feel like, this idea of community that you're doing it with. And so you're part of that community, and then when they switch to TV, that gets changed a bit, but then when they switch the programming to this more urban too, I feel like there's also been a change in the programming to, instead of using your imagination and imagining yourself as involved in this community, it's very much asking you to be like identified with what's happening in the TV, like you are the programming,
Yes.
and then it's more effective. And I think that relates back to this idea that Marshall McLuhan talked about, where technology is like an extension of yourself.
No, and that's
Right?
it's very astute, and it does make a profound difference. And McLuhan talked specifically about the differences between film and television in that regard, in that film is more of a community thing, and because you go to a theater, there's a group of people, and it does begin to take on, any performer has understands a crowd of people has a pulse all its own, and they respond in a certain way, and the idea
Yeah,
of
and you
being
start
able
to
to.
synchronize
Yes,
with
to
people.
move
Yeah.
the crowd and that sort of thing. And if you're out of sync, that's, you're dying on stage, as comedians,
Yeah.
hate that. But when people go to see a film, partly because of the technology is described before, that it's a more passive medium, you're observing it as though it were happening. It is a more, again, you're an observer, right? So
Yeah.
it's less narrative and more observational. And then when it gets done, people walk out of the theater, and often, especially if it's a really good movie, they're unable to speak. They're kind of still processing,
Yeah.
and they have to sort of process. And then when you get
And
to
you're like, who am I now that this is done?
right, yeah, exactly. It really it moves you, but in a way that is observational, right? You're an observer.
Hmm.
Whereas with television, it really has much more of a narrative transport effect, that you inject yourself into the action, and you become
Yeah.
more of an active participant
Yeah.
in what's happening. And I watch very closely, and now that I see things again with eyes to see, television shows that I didn't watch for a long time, because I'm not a consumer of that kind of media, but I will from time to time make it a point to look at things, and I can go look at shows that were popular, right? Big, long things. And there's some I haven't looked at, but for example, procedurals were really popular. So like Law and Order and SVU and all this sort of stuff. And as
Yeah.
I go back and I look at the topics, and I've watched a few of them in their entirety, what I notice is that these are all now, against the Overton window, exactly what they've done is they've presented an emotional narrative transport to suck you in and make you part of a emotionally tense situation, and then make you make an internal ethics decision, a judgment call about what is right and what is wrong. And they're feeding you false information, and so you always choose on the side of what the program narrative is.
The
So
authority,
exactly.
basically.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Like
And so
reinforcing.
it reinforces it and creates these ideas, and so I can draw a direct one-to-one corollary between the ideas that were shown on these programs, and the reason they call them programs, right? We always
Mhm.
play with that, but it's certainly true that they are programming you.
Literally.
Yes, they're literally programming you with these ideas, and the principle of narrative transportation, that you become an active participant in the events, and especially traumatic events. So
Yeah.
this explains why we see so much violence on television, right? Is because the traumatic event causes it to sink in more, and that's the way that we lay down memories, right? The way that we learn is through categorically grouping things and pattern recognition. That's how we learn as human beings, and so we group things together, and we make these sort of judgment calls. And so as they begin to sink in, the things that we lay down as memories are the things that have emotional impact to us. So unless it was a super great meal, you can't remember what you had for breakfast 5 days ago, unless you eat the same thing every day. But unless it was some aspect of it that was really great, or you were with somebody, you had a great conversation, unless there was something particularly memorable about it. And what makes things memorable is that you have an emotional attachment to it, right? Otherwise, we would have so much information in our head, we couldn't do good memory recall and group things appropriately. So as we group these things together, the more important things to us, the things that create memories, are when there's an heightened emotional state. And creating a traumatic situation does that. This is again certainly borne out when people begin to they develop relationships after going through a traumatic experience. You will all often see this in movies about survival. The
trauma
guy,
bonding.
yes, exactly, trauma bonding. But it does happen. It does occur in people who survive a harrowing experience together. This is explains in part why soldiers after combat become lifelong buddies. Right, they never lose touch with each other because they've gone through these experiences. So that makes it stick. Right, there are several.
This is why they might, whether you believe in that it's false flags or that it actually happened, these traumatic events, these mass shootings and things that happen that captivate the nation, again, whether you think it's fake or real, either way, it's still effective because you're still having this emotional response. It's uniting everyone in the nation under this common, like nationalistic pride, perhaps. Absolutely. And then also allowing them to program in whatever this message is. In many cases, it's anti-guns and pro government authority.
Sure, and without ever considering the actual arguments behind it. I mean, the idea is like none of them can argue.
There's no logic.
There is no logic, and none of them can argue it. And again, they get mad and immediately go to ad hom attacks, calling you all kinds of,
what about the children every time?
Yes, pedophilia, right? Yes,
and that's why it's effective because you can't fight a child.
Using a child as a human shield, right, to promote an agenda. It's pedophilia. Yeah, it is disgusting, and it's the worst kind of evil to me because they know it. It's again, some people know it. Everybody, again, as it trickles down, more and more people become, again, emotionally invested in the narrative. And so, as I watch again, that's why I'm often don't get as frustrated and angry at the general population, what I call the wool wearing folks. I don't like the word, sheep or sheeple.
Yeah,
even though
you don't want to degrade people, but you have to have like some way to describe.
Yeah, because it doesn't help, right? It's
right.
You're never going to help someone wake up to it by making them defensive.
Names, yeah,
exactly. It's not going to help. So
criticizing them.
Right. And
it's not really anyone's fault. And that's actually something I want to, because we never really touched on. Do you have an idea about what it is that makes 10% of people or whatever it is on that side of the bell curve not able to be programmed, or less able to be programmed, or less able to be hypnotized, or more likely to wake up?
So my view of it at this point, again, I mean, this is my hypothesis for now, does have to go directly with the how susceptible people are to the power of suggestion. And it largely, from my view, has to do with people who have trust issues. If you as a very young person, like before the age of 3, if you found that you were not able to, and I'm not talking about people who become have radical attachment disorder or anything like that,
right?
Who's again, their brain literally changes. They're never going to be normal in that regard. But just people who have some trust issues and have a lack of trust and authority, and who will question things and are largely, I find that they're usually of above average intelligence. That's not always true, because you get some real there's some people in the quote truth community who do they just pick another narrative and accept whatever somebody else says, right? So they'll listen to Rogue Ways, or they'll listen to Dearth or Jeranism or whoever, and then they just accept that. They don't look into it and do any of the research themselves, and that's no more helpful than accepting. In fact, it's probably more harmful than accepting the given narrative, because
it just means that you can be reprogrammed again.
Exactly. and you don't really know for yourself what you believe, and I find that just tragic. But I think it does have to do, I mean, from again my view, it has to do with people who are curious, that they want to know the answers. They have a little bit of some trust issues or problem with authority in some regard, where they just don't inherently trust the authority to take care of them. And this other combination of less susceptible to the power of suggestion, because suggestion has very much to do with a person's trust. And so with what you're okay with. again, there's all kinds of factors, and people are different, and there's all kinds of neurochemical things going on. But
Yeah.
but these are the consistent things that I find is that people who tend to wake up have, again, many of them are, either again, you find adopted people or people who from broken homes. That's a common denominator. People who again have early deep-seated sort of trust issues and some ability I find to get over trauma, to be able to absorb it, and
Yeah.
they adopt good coping mechanisms and not unhealthy ones. So when
So
they're
there's
able,
people who go the other way that have had
there
the
are,
same mix, right? They're
yes.
intelligent and they have trust issues but then they've gone to the path of like, I guess the dark side or whatever you want to call it, where they're
Yeah,
just
well, I
like
mean, they
murdering and
yes, they
whatever.
find a coping mechanism that they think works for them or works
Right.
to some degree, whether that is passive aggressive behavior, whether that's being a narcissist, whatever that in order, because again, everybody, in my view, everybody has a drive to get what they want or need, and they often
Yeah.
conflate those two. They're not certain which it is, right?
Right.
I want food, but I need tacos.
I
Um,
desperately need a baby warthog like as quickly as possible.
I
It's a
need
need.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're again, in my view, we all have a myopic spot, a blind spot to ourselves that we simply don't have a good internal vision. We just can't see ourselves clearly, and we have to see it through the eyes of others. And so most people live their lives. I've often said it's not what I think, it's not what you think, it's what I think you think. That
Yeah.
most people, what we do is we have a tendency to mirror approval from others when we behave in a manner that is consistent with what we perceive to be approval from other people. And
Yeah.
so that gets us what we want. That gets
It's
us the
strange
cheese.
though, because I have this, I hate this about myself, but I have like this desperate need to have other people's approval. But the people's approval I want is not like the mainstream. It is like I'm happy if I have an authority figure's approval for some stupid reason that's been programmed into me since I was a child, right? But the people's approval I want are usually not that sort of like authority. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't want anyone's approval, period. I'd like to get rid of that. But I also find it strange the type of approval that I look for.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing because it's an inherent need to be wanted and accepted. That's I think,
Yeah.
in fact, when you go through, like Maslow's concentric circles of need, the very
Right.
first thing before even love is acceptance, right? Because
Yeah.
we don't believe that we're loved if we don't believe that we're accepted, and so we have to be accepted first and then loved, and then you can't give love until you know what it looks
And
like and
this
all those
is why
things.
we're so programmable, right? That bullying
Yes.
tactic is so effective because we want to be accepted
Yes,
and approved of.
and so
Yeah.
the whole thing, in fact, going back to the idea of education as indoctrination, is
Mm.
that you don't get approval until you do what they want, which is to
Yeah.
simply accept and repeat the words. Um, eh,
It's
you,
so evil.
yeah, so they withhold approval, and so again, you either have to uh, accept it. And again, it's pretty rare for people to do it young, but it does happen. I know it happened for me and a few other people, but that we go, I'm probably smarter than you, again, which is kind of narcissistic, and that
But
happens
it's
at some
often true.
people. But it's also probably true, right? That
Yeah.
it's like I know that I'm more clever than you, and I just have this inherent distrust that you know what you're talking about, right? That
Right.
I knew early on, you're just repeating what somebody else told you, and you would have no way of knowing whether that were true or not. And you're right, you're invested, and so you're going to do what is necessary to get your approval.
Mm.
Right. So everybody is sucking the titty of somebody else. Right. I've said before that everybody's somebody else's bitch. Right.
Yeah.
Whether we want to be or not,
Yeah.
we do need approval from others, and so largely it depends on who we're willing to accept that approval from, and to be aware of why we want it, and if we're largely, most people are unable to approve of themselves, really, because we know we're
Mm.
fractured and broken, and most people can't forgive themselves for that, and they instinctively know, whether they admit it or not, that they're responsible for most of the bad things that happen to them. We
Yeah.
want to find an external source of our pain, and we want a scapegoat, but for the most part, most of the things that happen to us are the result of our own choices. It's just the way it is, and we don't want to accept responsibility for that. So we want to look for an external source. So we blame other people and give ourselves victim status, and that is to me, one of the most horrid things about current culture is that this glorification of victim status. So
It's
they
so
create even
alluring.
Yeah, so they
And even the victim, even like people who aren't in the victim classes get to have sort of victim status by like allying with them and like
yes.
defending them.
Exactly, or
Yeah.
even accepting, white guilt, or
Mhm.
I have white privilege or whatever. It's nonsense, right? That's such a, again, a misleading term, because to me it has nothing to do with privilege I have from white. It means that non-whites are more oppressed, right?
Yeah.
It's a reversal of burden of proof. It's exact
Yeah.
projection. And so, why should I take responsibility for something somebody else is doing to
And I didn't
all
even
of
ask
us?
for. Yeah.
Yeah, to all of us, right? The boot is on
Yeah.
everybody's necks. They're stepping on you harder.
Yeah.
That's not my fault. What we should do is get the boot off our neck, right?
Let's
Don't
band together.
Right,
Yeah.
don't blame me, but that is the divide and conquer, the classic divide and conquer tactic, which
Right.
has been used to everybody, which is why, to me, that we see such a polarizing view in news and politics, and why, again, the modern narrative, if somebody disagrees with you, then they're your mortal enemy,
Yeah.
and that is,
It's
again,
crazy.
it makes no sense.
No.
It really doesn't make any sense. It is crazy, and I see more and more, to me, the result of, again, what Huxley said: when people are over programmed, when they use the mind control too heavily, they fracture, they become broken. I mean, to an extent that they can't function. And I see that more and more in society. The suicide rates
Mhm.
are climbing, and
Yeah.
the age at which the attempts happen are going down.
Yeah.
They simply cannot, people cannot adjust to the rapid change. We're not made that way. We're made to have stability and security. And when we don't get it, and we are constantly, we have that approval withheld unless we
Mhm.
do exactly what was desired. And most of the time,
And it's
um,
pretty hard to do exactly what is desired.
yeah, and
You know,
most of the time, those are unspoken expectations, which is
true.
a recipe for failure all the time.
Mhm.
I'm not going to tell you what I want, but that's not it, right?
Yeah. Guess what's in my head and then do it.
Yeah, and that's going to change week to week, by the way. So
Yeah.
what you did before that got approval is not going to do it now. So everybody runs around trying to get the cheese, right? We want that cheese, and they keep moving the target,
What a way to
and
get the
making,
cheese.
yes, and making everybody fight over it, and they throw little scraps in, and that's the way that, again, they keep us distracted and controlled. It's
It's
a
sad too, because I see, especially with the race thing, right? So people are like, oh, it's so refreshing to finally have, people of color in these leading roles. And I'm like, does no one remember like the 70s and the 80s? And,
yeah.
like we had a lot of people of color in lots of different roles. And I'm just not sure how they convinced us that this is some new thing that's like just now happening and that we're just now finally being aware of it. It's like this has
Right.
been happening for decades.
And
Um,
what happened to the dream of, that we would judge people on the content of their character and not the color of their skin, right?
exactly.
We have let go of that entirely.
Well, you're a racist if you say that. So this just happened to me where I pointed out there's I won't get into the specifics, but I pointed out, well, it's interesting that people are celebrating these people being chosen for this role when it's based on the color of their skin, and that is racist. And it'd be really way cooler if it just so happened that they were people of color, but they were chosen for the content of their character, and people did the standard thing. They got
Sure.
really angry and attacked me and called me a racist because how dare I say that these people don't have good characters. I'm like, you completely misunderstood everything I said.
Well, and it's, I mean, as we were talking about before we started, Lindsay, is like one of the things that is true is that, that deep calls unto deep, and people have a tendency to migrate toward and have an affinity toward people who are like them in one form or
Yeah.
another. And earlier we were talking about it in the context of, that we gravitate toward people who are as screwed up as we are, and
Yeah.
that's true. That, right, we because it creates an imbalance of power. But it's also true that, and I have observed it throughout my life, that even with race, there's a certain amount of self-segregation, not because
Yeah.
of any antipathy toward another race, but
No.
because you're more comfortable with the known. And so you're going to naturally gravitate toward people who speak like you, look like you, talk like you. It's a
Well,
human condition of mirroring.
and
And so you want
beyond
to,
it's beyond looks too, right? Because there can be
yes.
like Brother Ali is a albino white rapper who grew up
Yep.
in a black neighborhood, and so he has that culture. So it's even beyond look, and it's like you were saying, it's more about this internal sort of whatever you want to call that, culture, programming,
It,
conditioning, or whatever that you
it
see
absolutely
mirrored.
It absolutely is. And
Yeah.
so to me, I mean, I have friends of all kinds of stripes,
Yeah.
left, right, center, color, gender, whatever. And our, least common denominator is that we have thought processes and views that are similar, even though, we don't not only not agree on everything, we in some cases don't agree on, we agree on very little in terms of
Yeah.
the ultimate place that we're going. Although what I find very fascinating is that many of us get to similar place from very different paths, and that
I
to me
love that.
is fascinating.
Yeah.
But for example, and I'll go back to Crow for an example, because again, he's a friend and we've had a lot of conversations, and we see some things very differently. But to me, that's never let that get in the way of, oh, we're going to have an argument over, try to convince each other. We simply
No.
see things differently, and we have reasons for that, right? There are
Yeah.
good reasons why, and we're unlikely to convince each other of those things because we have different experience, right? So much of our belief system is based on again, experience and what we found to be true when we were younger. And most people, again, have very difficult time. I love that he put it in a very succinct way that belief is the enemy of knowing, and that was one of the reasons that I started listening to him in the first place. It was because of that, because I had prior to that discovered that most of my epiphanal moments came as a result of closely examining and letting go of closely held ideas, to
And
such that I
that
could accept new information.
and that is so difficult, especially because I think a lot of people don't even recognize what they have that are beliefs. Because like we have this tendency to just be like, well, this is just fact. And it's like, well, no, that is a belief. But if you can't even recognize it as a belief, then how can you get to the point where you're questioning whether or not it has any validity?
Right, because it's been presented to you as fact, and therefore you accept it as fact rather than as a belief. Like most people, for example, accept spirituality as a belief because it's non-material, and we live in a society that's pushed a material world, and the non-material is hocus pocus. And so they sort of accept that if they go down the path of belief, it is sort of hocus pocus. You can't prove the existence of God or whatever, or reincarnation or whatever happens when you die, right? Like nobody here knows, and nobody from there is coming back to tell us, right? So you have to sort of take it on faith, and so people accept that as belief, but they don't accept the things that you were taught as history or science or any of that stuff. Those are, oh, that's proven fact. Well, let's go back and examine, how did that fact get put in a textbook? And when you go back and look at it, not only is most of it just flabbergastingly, shockingly flimsy.
Yeah.
But then you find that much of it is again, common sense and rational thought will tell you immediately it's nonsense, and it's cooked up in hocus. When for example, the view of history, the timeline that we're given, and then you go back and you see all these archaeological structures that defy that completely, and then just go, I don't know, pyramids,
throw it
whatever.
away.
Yeah, they built it in 40 years, like a million of them. Get a bunch of people together, and it's a tomb. Yeah, come on,
It's
right?
a tomb.
It's preposterous, right? So everything's a temple or a tomb, right? And they just go with that narrative, and so we have,
despite any evidence to the
right,
contrary.
we have all the evidence to the contrary. We have
All of it,
enormous.
yeah.
We have just myriads of evidence to the contrary, and yet they stick to that narrative and will push out anybody who even suggests that they maybe we don't
and
know.
call them racist, which gets us back to this thing, like if you can just have a word that dismisses any thought, how powerful is that?
So again, I would just encourage anybody that if you have any question about anything, anytime you hear these words, the debate is over. It's a proven fact. Yep, settled science. It's proven fact. I will tell you, almost without exception, they're lying to you. They're not just mistaken; they're lying. But I have come to a place of saying that certainty is the imminent domain of frauds and fools.
Yeah.
They're either lying to you or they're badly mistaken. But if anybody is certain about anything, you can say, I'm certain the sun will come up tomorrow. Are you? There's good evidence. There's a high probability,
relatively certain,
high probability that that's going to happen, right? But to be certain about it, man, you can't prove that. And there's very little that can actually be empirically proven.
Very little.
People often get confused about science, right? About the scientific method and what that means, and that really it's a hypothesis test, and so anything that cannot be empirically proven, say astrophysics or theoretical physics, is by its very definition pseudoscience. And pseudoscience is anything that presents itself as science, as having gone through the scientific method, that cannot be done. And so by its very nature, everything from astronomy, astrophysics, theoretical physics, quantum physics is by its very definition pseudoscience. It's simply a mathematical construct that they try to confirm hypothesis that way. But if anybody tells you those things, they're lying. right? And so, but people get confused about this, and so they think the laws of physics really it's a law because we can't explain why. We often can't even explain how, but we can only say that we observe it happen in
Yeah.
every case, and so then it becomes a law, right? So we have second law of thermodynamics of entropy. It's a law because it happens in every case, and so and we can measure the effects of that, and so we can elucidate it as a law, but we can't describe either the why. In some cases, we can get the how, we can determine that, but we don't know why, and yet they will present as though we understand the universe, 14
Perfectly. Yeah.
14.7 billion years ago. That's nothing exploded into everything.
Yeah.
And again, it's on prima facie, it's preposterous, right? It's just, it's to me, it defies, again, rational, logical thought, which most people, this is what I find is most people are incapable of it. And
Really, they
just like
are.
we
It's
were talking about
stunning.
before we began, right? We were talking about geography, and I know geography quite well, and I've traveled all over the world.
Yeah.
But suddenly, again, another example is a number of years ago when I worked for a manufacturer, I knew upwards of 375 phone numbers off the top of my head of all of our
Wow.
dealers, and I could just call any one of them, right? Just because I knew the phone number.
Wow.
And now maybe 10 phone numbers because I never dialed them, and we just
That too.
yeah, we just hit the thing. And so what happens again, neuroplasticity of the brain is really smart and it's very efficient. And so rather than learning the information, we learn where the information is kept. And
Yeah.
so we have become dependent on technology such that, again, just like the barn wall in 1980 or in Animal Farm or was Animal Farm, it keeps changing and we can't quite remember. And that's in part why I think the like Mandela effect thing is in part a psyop. It
Yeah.
gets you to not trust your own senses, and all of
Mm.
the current sciences don't trust your own senses. Don't believe yourself, believe us. And in a similar way, you can't quite remember the things so you can accept it. Well, I was pretty sure, but maybe not.
Yeah.
We will easily accept that we could be mistaken, and frankly, memory is it's pretty squishy, and you can create false memories and do all kinds of stuff. And in fact, eyewitness testimony is some of the worst when you get into studying that sort of stuff. But
Yeah.
ultimately, we're being told to deny our own senses and to accept the authority of somebody else as gospel truth and fact. And it's simply not the case. And that would be, I mean, to me, that's probably if I were to be evangelistic about anything, it's question everything, right? Don't take
Right.
anybody's word for anything and start out with a healthy level of skepticism. If somebody tells you something, and the more certain they are, and the more they want to harass you for not believing it, the greater the probability that it's false narrative.
Yeah. Absolutely. I just I wanted to touch back on that the idea that, there's these things that we accept as having been proven, even though we really haven't proven them, like gravity and, these laws that you're talking about. But I also, something that kind of stunned me with math and science both, is that in order to practice either of them, in order to travel down any of the pathways that they've sort of laid out, you have to first accept axioms.
Mhm.
Right. And this like blew my mind when I realized that what axioms are just things that we're saying, we don't know. We're just going to say this is true. And then we're just going to run that way. And I was like,
Sure.
so really all of it, all of
It,
science and all of math is just built on something that it's almost like it's just a tool, right? Like we just
it,
put it
it
there so
is.
that we could have these thought experiments,
It
but then
is.
we treat them as though they're like, unshakable
Sure.
foundational facts.
Sure, especially the maths, and using it to support science, and you'll often hear the dyed in the wool globe believers will say, maths is reality. Well, no, it's not, because I can present just a simple quadratic equation that proves that any number is equal to any other number. There's a secret trick to it,
Yeah.
and it's one that I
I
learned
think
early
my
on.
math teacher showed
Yes,
us that one. Yeah.
but if you do it longhand and don't use a computer or a calculator, you're almost never to find out the secret trick to it.
I couldn't
And
figure it out.
it's a magic trick. I figured it was my sophomore year of high school, whatever. But so every geometry equation begins with if A equals, right?
True.
And in fact, the entire Newtonian book Principia Mathematica, right, begins with if. So if we accept this, then
Yeah.
right, and so we go on, and so it's entirely a thought experiment, and so you have to accept, as you said, those axiomatic principles to begin with, and again, some of them can be borne out and either proven or demonstrated in some way, but most of them. I'm gonna say most of them are to a level either misdescribed or described in it's I'd say misdescribed. It's either an overt whole made out of whole cloth lie, or it's a misdescription. And I see this over and over again within specifically the sciences, that it is there's truth in it. It's like,
Yes.
for example, I look at all religions and I say there's truth everywhere
Yeah.
you look, but a lot of it's buried underneath poo, and you
Yeah.
got to dig through the poo to get to the
Really.
gold. But doesn't devalue the gold. It just makes it a little stinky and makes people less likely to go digging.
Right.
But you still got gold if you get to it, right? But
Yeah.
don't hang on to the poop. Keep the gold and let go of the poop. So
Discernment is key.
key, absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, I find that very few people are frankly willing and disciplined enough, or either trust themselves enough or are capable. And more, again, I don't want to bag on anybody. I mean, when it comes to intellect, right? A lot of people, they get really shook up if they think that you're just trying to be a smarty pants. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, okay, so I've been me for a long time, but it doesn't make me, being bright doesn't make you a better person. In fact, for the most part, it gives you a temptation to be a dick,
Yeah.
because you can manipulate people, and I didn't want to do that personally, and but what I find is that it's just another asset. It's like I describe it. It's like being tall, right? So you can be tall, and people go, "Oh, how's the weather up there?" Well, and they're not likely to just go ape shit over. You say,
Yeah.
clever guy. They don't lose their crap over it, right? But
Right.
being tall isn't always great. I mean, sure, you can reach the stuff on the top shelf, and you have a different perspective of things. But finding a bed that fits, or clothes, or cars are really uncomfortable, and
Airplanes.
a lot of things in the world don't work for you. And in the same way, intellect is really a major obstacle to relationships, because it creates an imbalance, a perceived imbalance of power, and people feel like, oh, you're making me feel stupid. No, that's not me. That's you,
That's
right?
you. Yeah. I
I
didn't do
mean,
anything.
yeah, I didn't do anything, right? And for the most part,
Right.
I spend a great deal of effort making sure that I relate to people in a way that they're comfortable with. And if I tried to drag them down the way that my brain works, like a pachinko machine, they'd be lost in a minute, right? And I sometimes will say that, really, really smart people sound really, really crazy to really, really dumb people, right? And to
Right.
me, again, it's not a judgment, right? Like, so to me, saying
No.
somebody's not very intellectually smart doesn't mean that they're either a bad person or have any character flaw. In fact, and they might be way better at some things. I mean, it'd be a terrific athlete, right? So I mean, some of those guys make many millions of dollars a year. So
Right.
I mean, it's not a judgment thing to me. It's like
No.
some people are more attractive than others. Yet people lose their crap when you say that, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, nobody wants to be the ugly guy. Everybody thinks themselves smart, and so we have this sort of optimism bias where we always think, everybody thinks their kids are going to be above average, which is a statistical impossibility. So
Right.
everybody believes themselves smart, which is sort of the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Where
Right.
they lack the exact skills they need to really judge the competency that they have. So, right?
Yeah.
Oh, as soon as I
Right.
learned about, I went to school, and you don't understand gravity. Okay, well, describe it to me. Well, we know
Yeah.
it's proven, right? It's like, no, it's not. And if you would take the time to look at it really closely, right, and really for yourself do the math and walk through it, you'll find that it's not. And again, they have reason either not to trust themselves or to trust an authority. They wouldn't all lie to us. And again, that's where they get caught. Everybody gets caught in the
Yeah.
trap of, well, why would they lie? And I just go, why is a horrible question, right?
Yeah.
So like, why did I walk into a room and there's blood on the floor and a knife, right? And there's bloody footprints going out the door. Well, why would somebody kill him?
Yeah.
I know there's a ton of reasons, but there's a guy on the
But
floor
here we
dead.
go. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
This is here right now.
yeah, exactly. It doesn't preclude that somebody's dead on the floor and murdered. It's not likely a suicide, right? So we have that to go with. Someone with a size 12 footprint, looks like a man, accosted this guy and took his life with a sharp object.
Like, well, people aren't like that.
Yeah, well, exactly, because you wouldn't do it, then you can't imagine anybody else do it. So when you get to all this stuff about psychopaths running the world, well, they wouldn't do that. The fuck they wouldn't. I mean,
you can't get through it. You can't get through to people because they just stick on that. They're just like, no, but that's not. Why would people lie about it? Why would people say that kids died when kids didn't die? And it's like let's
Just like
just look at the evidence that it's pretty fucking obvious that they
go back.
didn't.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean,
Who
okay,
cares
so
why at
there's a school
first?
that hadn't had internet access for 3 years, and it's Christmas time,
Yeah.
and there's no Christmas decorations up. Just those two things on its own should be enough to make you go, wait a minute.
Okay, the one thing that I always have to point out to people is Robbie fucking Parker
Yeah,
is sitting
Wayne
there laughing,
Carver.
laughing, and then he goes and starts crying.
Oh
Well,
yeah,
as soon as the camera gets turned on, he thinks he didn't
Wayne Carver.
realize he's being recorded. It's like what parent would ever do that when
Ever.
a kid died the day
No,
before?
and beyond that, well, so
Oh,
again,
jeez.
to anybody who's ever been a parent, and I am a grandparent as well, to look at this, they did, supposedly about 26 kids died or whatever it is, and they didn't let any of the parents like come in and identify or see the kids. They buried them straight. No parent would.
Fucking
They would
crazy.
kill. They would kill
Yeah.
anyone who tried to stand between them and their kid, no matter what. I mean, there's
And
not a
they would
single
not go on the news 4 days later and be smiling.
36 hours or less.
You'd be
Yeah.
like in your bed for days, just like, or something. You just
Yeah,
not on the news
yeah, they're
smiling.
not going to laugh and go, they're an angel and they would forgive. That's
La, la, la. Yeah.
well, people process grief differently.
They
No,
do.
I mean, yeah, they
And
do.
it can be weird, but all of those parents were
Exactly.
smiling and happy.
Right. So one or two coincidences, okay, that
Yeah.
but does not mean anything. But when you start to put it all together, right, then again, and I just say, again, people are inherently flawed, right? So you go, what would you do for $1 million? Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so would you steal a loaf of bread for $1 million? If you
Hell
knew
yeah.
you couldn't get caught, if you knew you weren't going to get caught, and we'll
Yeah.
back you up 100%, the national press will back you up, would
Right.
you go in and steal a loaf of bread for $1 million?
Yeah.
Fuck. I mean, who's going to say no to that, right?
Right.
So then you start going, okay, well, okay, so let's say, for example, you had the power to take 20% of everybody living in your town's money, and but they have to, right? I mean, would you? I mean, again, there's almost no one who wouldn't do something a little underhanded to get an advantage over
ahead.
somebody else. And then once you start getting groups of people, very small groups of people who have an enormous amount, that the balance of power is so skewed, right? So we now have 0.3% of the the world population that have over 98% of the resources. So
Insane.
it's insane. It's psychopathic, right? So
Yeah.
so now imagine, just for a moment, imagine that they're not going to do whatever they can to keep that, right? It's preposterous. So
Right.
would they tell you kids died? Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, they do more than that. They would go kill kids, right? They wouldn't have any problem. They do.
They do
Right?
it in
So
Yemen every day.
right, all the time. So just because you wouldn't do it, right, doesn't mean that probably will tell you that. Again, I'll say all the time, flip things upside down and then turn it a little bit, because they never give it to you exactly in verse, because it's too easily got. So instead of 180 degrees, it's like 172 degrees. It's a little bit skewed there, so you can't just turn it upside down and get the exact truth. But that's the way I approach everything. So everything that's in the media, I mean, I read a news digest daily. I read few of the articles in depth because I don't need to. I can look at the headline, and what I'm really looking
themes.
yes, exactly. What I'm really looking for is what's the tone and tenor of what's happening, keep my finger on the pulse, and what is happening, and which way they're trying to push, and what's the newest, latest thing. And I can watch it happen in real time. And I can watch, I have say about a dozen or so people that I know on Facebook who are otherwise very bright, motivated, successful people who are so completely mesmerized and hypnotized that the moment something hits the news, I know for sure they're going to trigger and give the exact appropriate PC response to whatever that is. So whether that's Boston Strong or what, they're nobody's faster with supporting that narrative. They know exactly what to do. They follow exactly the cues. And I find it remarkable. And from time to time, I'll say, don't you think it uncanny that I can list these 12 people, and you guys are all going to have, within an hour, you're all going to post exactly the same response. Like, you're going to come to the identical conclusion, and
on the same day at the same time, like
exactly.
this thing where
within an hour, you're going to say almost verbatim the same thing.
Verbatim.
And yeah,
how many people recently have started saying that anyone criticizing Greta is afraid of her?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Seen that? Like,
you're just fatter because
you got this talking point.
she's smarter than you are. It's like,
you're afraid of her.
No.
I don't know anyone who's afraid of her.
No, we're sick of seeing her, and we're tired of having a narrative pushed down our throats as false. And we're also annoyed that you would use children to do it, and you're using it as a meat shield, and it's really disgusting.
Yeah.
So yeah, so but their argument is usually, well, any rational person would come to that same conclusion with the information we're providing. I'm like, yeah, but
Pretty
giga, right?
rational.
Garbage in, garbage out. If
Yeah.
you're being fed false information,
Right.
take for instance example. And this is partly again how they get you by being invested. So with the 9/11 thing, right? And be careful about what we say there. The slim towers or however people put it.
The
But
slim towers.
I watched it happen in real time. I was living in Los Angeles, and I was scheduled to go later that weekend to New York for a trade show. And so my mom called at like 6 o'clock in the morning. She lives in Texas, and she called me, and she was just in a panic. And she's like, "Where are you?" And I said, "In bed." Right?
Yeah. It's
It's like
early.
5:45 in the morning. What are you doing to me? And she goes, "Turn on your TV." And I'm like, "What?" She's, "Turn on your TV." And I'm like, "What channel?" She's like, "Doesn't matter." I'm
It
like,
doesn't matter. Yes.
okay. I turn it on, and I see the one tower smoking, and I'm like, holy crap. So I got the phone with her because she was concerned that I was, in New York and I was in danger, because that's
Yeah.
what moms do. And so I called my boss and woke him up, and I said, dude, turn on the TV. And he's like, what channel? I'm like, it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
So we see this happen just in time to watch the second image of a plane, I'll put it that way,
Right.
appear to go into another tower. And so the first thing I said while on the phone to him is, well, what did we do to piss off Osama bin Laden? And so the thing is, so you feel like you're smart because you put you followed the breadcrumbs, and you put it all together yourself. It was before anybody on TV had said it, right?
Yeah.
Well, also because I'd been following, CNN and news for months prior as people were talking about this threat, and we'd had this thing with the I can't remember his name now. The guy in a wheelchair that got thrown off the cruise ship, and that was supposed to have been Bin Laden's group that did that. So there was a cruise
I
ship.
missed that entirely.
Well, it's maybe in kind of before your time. Again, this was late
Yes, I think there was-
1987, something like that.
Okay.
It was the first we kind of heard of Osama bin Laden, that he was in charge of this Al Qaeda thing, and they were responsible for the. Oh God, it was Costa something. Anyway, there was a cruise ship, and there was an elderly Jewish couple, and he was in a wheelchair, and supposedly they shot him in the head and tossed his body overboard. And so that was
Was he some
kind of
important world figure, or is this just random?
just random,
Okay.
elderly couple. But it was enough to, people
Play on your heartstrings.
terrorism, rah, rah. And it started putting the name Osama bin Laden out there. So he was supposed to be in this existential threat to the security of the United States, and they were, and it was easy to follow. I mean, it seemed like a reasonable idea that the Middle East was mad at us because of our intervention over there in the 1950s with Iran, and our politics over there, and we'd been doing all kinds of crap. So
Right.
I've been aware of the nature of, sort of, to a degree, the illusion, but not just the overarching thing. That was kind of more recently just how pervasive that is. But anyway, so they've been feeding this information, so it was easy to follow the little breadcrumbs, and you go, oh, I figured it out on my own, right? So and then when they said later, oh, Osama bin Laden, I'm like, oh, see, I got that figured out. I'm a pundit now. Look how smart I am. But now you're invested in it, and so as soon as they mentioned this passport at the bottom, I'm like, okay, this stinks to high heaven.
That doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't make
at
any
all.
sense at all. So, and then I wasn't aware to the cast of the day that Building 7 had fallen. So it was a couple of days later that I noticed that, and then this is before the days of YouTube. But then I had seen somewhere, and maybe it was a clip somebody showed somewhere online, but again, it wasn't on YouTube. I know that for sure.
Yeah.
But it showed the BBC reporter who was saying that the Building 7 had collapsed, and it was still in the background. And it was like 20 minutes prior to it actually having. And I'm like, yeah, okay. And I've seen controlled demolitions before, and I went, okay, this is nonsense. And then it hit me that they had got me in the trap of thinking that I had it figured out myself. And so now I was willing to start to defend the narrative because I had, in my mind, I'd come to those conclusions on my own. And I have now watched as that is a very repeating pattern I see all the time. And again, it's partly what we're talking about before about these procedural television shows and how they push things. And it's not just procedurals. It's everything from, again, I didn't watch Seinfeld until the very last episode. A friend of mine made me watch it because it was the ultimate episode. And of course, it made no sense to me because I hadn't been watching the whole time. It was like, this is just
this show sucks.
sucks, right? So, I mean, I've gone back and so now I get, some of the popular culture references and stuff, right? And Soup Nazi and Master of Your Own Domain. Yeah, those are funny, but they're really, tragically vapid people, and
Right.
overall, but so many of these ideas, you see what happens, especially if you go back and look at it in retrospect. You see how these ideas caught on, and people again experienced it vicariously, and it became a part of them. And so suddenly now, in their mind, again, they've experienced this thing vicariously through narrative transport, and so everybody has a shared common experience. It becomes part of the natural, the cultural narrative, and so everybody now thinks sort of the same way. And so again, another show I never watched, Friends, but I know the little gag, so I understand when people are carrying furniture and they go pivot. So yeah, I understand it's a gag that everybody thought was funny, but it's now in the cultural mindset. So like everybody sort of gets the joke, right? And you feel like you're on the outs if you don't.
Right.
So this sort of saturation of external experience, right? That's not something that you experience directly yourself, in the same way that most of our education is not something that you've experienced yourself. It's vicarious. It's something that's been told to you or experienced as a narrative, either through a film or through a book, but you haven't personally, you don't have the understanding. And this is really an important distinction between knowledge and understanding, is that knowledge is the ability to absorb and repeat accurately facts and figures. And this is what we do in school, is that you have the knowledge. You're gaining the knowledge of, E equals MC squared, or isosceles triangle, or, right triangles equals 180 degrees, right? So you get the information, but until you actually do it yourself, right? So I explain it often this way, is that so you've got a guy who's read everything, and he's an expert on mountain climbing, and he knows all the tools and all the history and everything, but he's never been on a mountain. And you got a Sherpa who knows none of that, but who are you going to trust to take you up the mountain? Well, if you go to the first guy, you die, right? Because he has no experience of going up there. So the difference is that the knowledge is information that you have and you accept, and you create a narrative within your head that makes it all make sense. We require that is to make sense of things, and it all has to kind of go together. And then you have understanding, right, which is the internalization of this, that you've actually processed, and it's now a part of you. And then ideally, then you would have wisdom, which is be able to take those and push it forward, and to be able to anticipate what's coming next, so that you can apply both knowledge and understanding to support wisdom and give you an idea of what to do in the future. And this is critical to the way that our world is right now, and that people lack any understanding. And this is why they push back on the idea that the narrative that's been sold to them, that the world is an illusory theater, and they're in the theater, and they don't understand it, because these ideas don't make sense to them when you go, hey, this small group of people controls the world, and the government's doing this and spraying the skies and doing all this bad stuff. And you're like, they wouldn't do that, because it goes against the way you understand it. And so suddenly the ice underneath you has broken. You can't accept that. It's going to, what it does, it tears your whole world apart, right? We talked about this early on, that your view of the world changes, and you go through this grieving process. So it's a wholesale change, and people they can't process that, right? So that's part of where the trap is maintained, is that it doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, most people will not go through that door, because it challenges their worldview. Well, people aren't like that. Well, most people aren't like that. But
some people are.
Some people,
and they have way too much power.
and they do it. And again, most people will simply accept what's told them from an authority figure, and then they're rewarded for accepting it and repeating it, and they're punished for not. And so again, everybody wants the approval, and they want to have that approval and to be acknowledged. They're not going to throw that away. Most people are unwilling to throw away their life, their relationships, their standing, their social standing, their status, over really truth. Really, I mean, or even the possibility that they have been sold a lie. And as Mark Twain said, it's easier to fool a man than to convince him he's been fooled, because there's ego involved, right? And that you don't it makes you feel stupid, right? To go back to the idea of intellect, right? People want to consider themselves smart, and they certainly don't want to feel naive and like they're easily duped, and so they will deny it. It's a fascinating thing.
It's fascinating that they have this so well figured out, that there's so many different layers to it, because you can see through some of it. Let's say, I don't know, you see kind of what you were talking about, like the different things about the slim towers that would point to a lie occurring. You can see through that, and you can kind of go, oh my God, what actually happened, what's happening. And then some other level of programming can come in and push you back in to accepting the lie, basically, right? Like some bullying will happen and you'll go back, or some threatening of the loss of status in some situation in your life will happen and you'll go back. Because like I've seen this where people seem to wake up and they seem to understand, and then they go back into it. So like they have these layers of the onion, like
Yep.
perfectly planned out to catch you at various different spots. And so even if you feel like you're someone who has become awoken, or you see the truth, or however you want to describe that,
Mhm.
you still have to keep like vigilant about it, because there's a million traps waiting to sort of draw you back into that. And I think that's another thing that Marshall McLuhan was talking
Yep.
about that I thought was fascinating, was the fragmentation and systematizing of
Yes.
everything, because you can't
Yes.
see it all at once, or it's very, very difficult to get to a point where you can see all of these layers at once, and all of the different disciplines that we are no longer encouraged to explore because we have to pick one and stick to it for the rest of our lives. And this is a huge detriment to
It
us.
it is, and that's one of the, I think, the fascinating things that I find with the fact that these conversations stopped, right, is that it becomes apparent, I think, if you look at it in context, and look at especially the higher minded conversations happening between, say, 1942 and about 1967. You can pretty easily put together that they understood the all the aspects of human psychology.
Yeah.
And so again, I think that one of the reasons the conversation stopped is because when you put together the idea that they mastered the psychology and the technology, and the control of electronic media all at the same time, it becomes a very easy jump to go, well, then someone would use that to their advantage, and so they stop talking about it because it's too easy. It's too easy to get, right? So when again, the further I go back and realize how in depth these ideas are. I mean, you can go way back to the Jesuits, all the way back to, really, I mean, on dividing lines about 1620, but even in the late 1500s, that they had worked out what is basically now boot camp for the military, right? They break down your
Right.
personality and then rebuild
Yeah.
it with a sense of just unquestioning, immediate respond to command without thinking, which is what they say is necessary in the battlefield. So you just follow instructions. But it is exactly what we see in the overarching community, right? And society, is that they have programmed people to accept blindly what they're told, and respond to these things. But they have figured it out to such a degree and such incredible depth, that they it is so well programmed and maintained to a degree that's, I mean, even for me, somewhat unfathomable when you really start putting together all the aspects of how much data they have, because data is the key. The more data that you have about something, the better you can manage it and manipulate it. They say
Right.
data is the new oil. And a very long time ago, I wrote software, and I wrote some software packages for the Tandy Corporation. I don't know if you remember them, Radio Shack, but they
Oh
did
yeah.
back in the day. They made their own computers and they had all this sort of stuff. But I worked for a division of theirs called Consumer Mail that handled special order items that they didn't normally carry at a Radio Shack store, but people would get, like specialized batteries, turntable, stylized and needles, cartridges, some vacuum tubes, media and audio, magnetic tape, and that sort of stuff. And so they were interested in finding out the category of people in their their customer base who would be more likely to buy that, and how to target this sort of stuff. And so in writing a relational database, I used what I called the chicken principle, which is really the prior to metadata and filtering, and really it was like Boolean operators before we had a name for that. But it was but I said the old joke is, why did the chicken cross the road? I said, if you tell me everything you can about the chicken, and so who's the chicken dating? Is he hungry? What time of day is it? What does the chicken like to do? What's the weather like? How big is the road? What's the traffic patterns? If you tell me all those things, I can tell you why the chicken most likely. I can narrow it down to why the chicken. There's probably these 3 or 4 reasons why the chicken would be motivated to cross the road, and so that's why I call it the chicken principle. And so that's kind of what I base this on, is the more data that I can aggregate, then the better chance I have. And so now they've got really, I would say, almost an infinite amount of data that, again, they know you better than you know yourself in terms of your daily patterns and what you do. And this is in part the result of electronic media, since the influx of computers and now smartphones and devices, is that there's almost not a single thought that you have or anything that you do that's not in some way done through this. Everything
telegraphed
you do,
in some way. Yeah.
In some way, there's almost nothing that you do that is, in analog. You don't write on paper much anymore, and you're not going to send a letter. Every thought that you have, again, it's based on some other things. And so now people say, instead of just saying things, they can think about something, and Facebook or something will show them an ad for it. And it's not by accident, right? It is, and in part, it's driving the information. They can influence you a little bit. And so you go, say, hey, wow, I'll have a burger for lunch. That's probably not an organic response. You didn't just get hungry for a burger. And they knew that where you were going to be. And so I've seen predictive models that the NSA says themselves that they're going for 100% accuracy. They're now at like 98.7 something percent accuracy, that they can predict within a fortnight, a 2-week window, exactly where you're going to be at what time of day. And you go, but that's impossible, because I respond to things that happen around me. It's like, it's just not as random as
I
you
don't
think
think
it
it's
is.
impossible, but I do think this, just like the bell curve, if there's these people who are they're less easily mesmerized or hypnotized, or impossible to hypnotize. I think that there is a group of people that is impossible to predict with accuracy. I'm sure you can still get it right much of the time, but I think that there's a group of people that has enough, whatever that is, spontaneity or actual, originality.
Here's where I think it comes down to in terms of that. And people always ask, what can we do to fight back and all this sort of stuff? Because it's unlikely that we're going to take up arms, and I mean, be super great or whatever, but it's not going to happen, because frankly, even the people that you think are at the top of the pyramids, if you know about them, they're not the top of the pyramid.
Plus, they want us to choose violence because they know how to react to that.
Exactly, right. And I think they're actually driving toward that. They're looking for a civil war, a reason for martial law, or some sort of total totalitarian control, and blame it on us, right? So that's
why they plant people in every protest that will cause violence, so they can be like, oh, look, we had to arrest them.
Sure, exactly. And I think that again, with false flag sort of stuff, what you're going to find,
except in the climate change protests, because they don't
I think because they're pushing that narrative, right? So, but when I knew. I've been predicting it, and sure enough, they came out that, on the FBI terrorism watch list or whatever, that, again, truthers and flat earthers and anti-vaxxers, they're potential terrorism threats. Right, exactly, right. So, like, how is that a threat? Exactly.
So because you question things.
Well, because they're going to, they don't trust the government. So basically, they're saying anything that leads people to not trust authority, right, it becomes a potential threat. And so I anticipate that we will see fairly soon. And we've already had a couple of minor incidents with people who would identify that they're going to be a patsy, either that, again, they set up that's a plant patsy, or what I see is that they're trying to drive somebody to snap as well. Right. And then they have a scapegoat, right? So you guys, we can't trust you, so we're going to have to take all your guns because you boogaloo guys, and you're all. Because you're all like that, you're a bunch of crazy, And so, one of the people on their list is ex-military, right? Because often they get in there, they don't only have training, but they also see it's a fraud.
Yeah.
Right? They're not there to protect our. Not they realize a lot of them wake up.
Right.
Some don't, but a number do. Right. And in some ways, just like the nobody's a harsher anti-smoker than ex-smokers. In the same way, there's some few people are more anti-government than former military, because they've had their lives risked by people who are psychopathic and don't give a crap about them and do it for personal gain.
For almost nothing,
Yeah, exactly. So for no reason other than to make a point sometimes. So, these are So we kind of get back to the idea of who is, who's going to be affected and who's not, and who's breaking the mesmerizing and who's not. I mean, these are to me fascinating topics, and I think that again with the level of programming, I find, for example, a lot of the nonsense that comes out that's just garbage. I mean, you look at a news report for, okay, here's an example. I don't know if you've seen it, but not something I follow, but again, it's my news feed because I watch everything. This purported incident at Paris Fashion Week where some supposedly later come out to be a comedian or whatever, but she gets up and walks with she walks with the models down the runway. And then who's going to go get her? Gigi Hadid comes in and pulls her aside. Okay, think that one through. So one, these things are so well controlled that nobody's going to get in there without multiple checks, and ain't nobody going to get up on a runway without being stopped. And she made it all the way to the end and around the corner. And the last person who's going to go run and try to accost somebody and go, hey, get out of here, is a rich, famous model. She's going to run away, right? All it's about is creating a viral moment, to send. So it's just stuff that makes no sense. But all this sort of thing, and one that was certain for me was the Tesla in space, right? It's so preposterous on the face of it, right? You're going, come on, tell me you don't believe this. You can't really believe this.
People
and they're just
believe it.
They were tears in their eyes. They're crying. It's so beautiful.
It doesn't even make sense.
I mean, if you understand anything about that vacuum, right, the 10 to the minus 17 torr, and he explicitly says it's not space hardened or anything, it's just a regular car in space. You're going, well, those tires would have instantly exploded. I mean, it's just so preposterous. But it is, to me, it's a litmus test, right, of how the program is taking, who it's not taking with, and it's dividing people, right? So
and how information spreads too, right? Because they're tracking who infects who, and
and to your point about that some people will back up a little bit when they get bullied. This is I've sort of been making a list for a couple of people of when I watch different groups. I don't spend a lot of time online, especially anti-social media, but there are a few places I go, and I can now, people will go, oh, I'm paranoid or whatever. But again, I did a brief bit of work for some intelligence communities way back in the day. At least I understand what kind of people they are and the way that they think. And so there are certain behavioral patterns that I see that differentiate trolls from actual disinfo agents. And because behavioral patterns and certain things that they say, and one of the first things that they do, it's almost common every disinfo agent, is they will show up and then immediately start browbeating people into, they're mocking them. They're not asking any questions. They're not. They'll never argue over the actual data itself or any of the claims. They just start browbeating people and calling them names, and they're trying to shame people and bully them into compliance. And a lot of people if they're just investigating, they'll back right the hell up and go, okay, not going there. Right. So they count on that. And there's a list of about 10 things I'm kind of putting together going, these are, again, any one of them, it could just be, whatever, but people who are trolls, again, people have motivations, and I watch for that, and there are the motivations of people who are Dunning-Krugered out, and they think they know something, and it gives them a chance to think that they're gonna mock somebody dumber than them, right? So that makes me feel smart because I can make somebody else feel dumb, and so they just parrot a few things, and they can't argue any of it. They have their own motivations, and they're just, some people like to stir the pot, and that's just how they are. But there are some other behaviors that are that raise red flags, and when I see 3 or more, I'm pretty convinced that what we're dealing with is, because when the military themselves say that they have a group of, I know for sure at least 20 to 30,000 just in the domestic, working on the domestic side, the information
just to go into chat rooms and groups and
it doesn't take long.
Reddit lists and you
can do the math pretty quickly, and you start. I mean, they're getting better at what their stock accounts look like. Initially, you can immediately identify them,
and soon they won't even need to have people doing it because they'll just have AI doing
it. Exactly. Yeah. So it's pretty much a full-time gig, and they have certain behavioral things, and they respond certain ways, and mostly I don't engage with them at all. I rarely feed the trolls. It's just not worth my time or aggravation. And they try to trigger you, right? That's one of their things, is they will try to get a rise out of you and get you to respond. So they can
attack you.
Yes, get you to respond emotionally and lose your shit instead of just staying calm and going, here are the facts, and just look at this and look at this. And most of the time, again, people, because we seek approval, right? There's nothing that makes just like somebody who's newly born again, right? They want to go tell everybody about Jesus because they found something that to them really works. And so I care about you. So I want you to be happy. So they're on fire and they want to go tell everybody. Well, of course, that's the last thing most people, want to hear. And so there's this dynamic, and it's again, so there's stuff on both sides, right? So there's the dynamic of that people want to go tell everybody, and so they're kind of annoying. But there's also a dynamic, and this is we were talking earlier. I can't remember if it was when we started before we started, not about cults and how they behave, and that the idea of the really hypnotized and the scientism and the hard progressive left behaves as a cult because you can't disagree with any of the items. You have to accept it, all of it. But one of the very cult-like things, and again, not to pick on anybody, but I see it specifically. It's easy to see in for example, the Jehovah's Witness and LDS Church, the Mormons, is that they one of the requirements for Mormons is that you have to go on a mission. You go on your 2-year mission. Like it's 18 for girls and 16 or 18 for boys. But they're required to go on mission. They give them the name elder or sister if they're a woman, and they go out there. And what happens is they go try to share their faith. They go door to door, and they get almost exclusively rejection. And so then they walk them through it, right? And they go, oh, but they build a camaraderie in this mutually experienced
emotional.
Yes, emotional response. And so, keep your faith, keep courage, and it develops a sort of this sense of us and them, right? So yes, we're all this group. We're better than, right? And so now anybody who speaks bad of us is Mormon bashing, right? You see this in. I told you I lived in Salt Lake City for a time. People are terribly rude drivers there. Right. And in parts because, they think they're already God. So I'm a God and you're not. I just take up that lane.
I'm going to get my own planet. So
exactly. So we're done. We're done here.
Right.
So, and I would always want to tell them, there's a difference between Mormons on bikes and Mormons in cars, right? The Mormons on bikes are really nice and Mormons in cars are buttholes. So before you tell me about the golden plates, maybe you ought to look at the golden rule, right? But their perspective is that if you take them to task for their behavior, then suddenly you're persecuting them because they're a Mormon.
Yes.
I didn't know you were a Mormon. I just know you're an asshole.
You can't attack so many groups of people now, right? You can't attack, not that anyone is attacking kids. You can't attack kids. You can't attack anybody of color for any reason. Like I've had people tell me, I've had people tell me like, well, you need to believe people of color. I'm like, every single person of color, I need to believe everything they say. Like, what are you even saying right now? This is preposterous. Like, I will believe anybody who presents evidence and rationale, to some extent, but I'm not just going to say blanketed, like believe all women, it's crazy. I've met women who lie about shit all the time to get what they want. That it just happens. Yeah.
And again, I mean, this standard psychological response. If you have a free ticket, you're going to use it to your advantage. It's human nature, right? So to say believe all women or believe every person of color, it's like, are you high right now? Like really? So
it's the most irrational thing I've heard. It's crazy.
Exactly. And so anyway, so the idea of the cult behavior, right, is so they draw you in with a sense of being special.
Membership,
right? So, you know the secret truth, and those people are all they're all the Gentiles or whatever,
the uninitiated, unwashed masses.
Yeah, so it becomes a sort of tribalism, right? So now so now anybody who tries to talk you out of it is trying to break your faith or trying to break your beliefs.
They're evil.
Right. So they have a negative influence, and they're to be avoided at all costs. And so most of those groups you'll find in every group like that, they will. There's very few of those. For example, religious groups that will call people not of their faith right. So Mormons call people non-Mormons. You're another thing. You're sort of subhuman, right? You don't really count. And Jews call it goy or Gentiles. And again, I'm not picking on anybody. I'm saying it's a mindset of tribalism, and everybody wants to belong. And so there's a positive benefit to that, right? It's the reason that kids in inner cities join gangs, because it gives them a sense of family that they don't get home. It's a natural, it's a desperate need in the human being to belong and to be a part of something, and something greater than yourself. I mean, that's an idea we could get to, is that's to me part of the biggest sociological problem right now, is that nobody really grasps onto something that's larger than themselves. They are the hero in their own story. And so if you are the biggest thing in your life is miserable.
Small, yeah.
Small.
Well, this is something that I wanted to get to before we close, is that the sort of, there's a few things I think that we can do aside from trying to question everything and use logic, which are like the basis, I think.
Yep.
There's a few more things that I think can kind of help. I don't even want to say insulate isn't the right word, but I guess propel you towards some sort of safety from all of these like onion layers of traps that we have set for us. And one of them is that kind of idea that I think you maybe were just starting to touch on, is almost like a spirituality, not a religion and not a cult, but this realization that maybe you're more than this physical body.
Sure. Yeah.
And that so is everything else alive, maybe, or however you want to take that. But
Well, I
think
think
about that is
first,
really positive.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I mean, even without getting even deeper than that, is just an idea of empathy for others, and realizing that, if you woke up, that means that at some point you were asleep, right? So you were just like them.
Right.
Waking up doesn't make you any better than anybody else, and in some ways, again, there's always the temptation of making yourself feel superior. Right. In the same way that intellect can do it, right? Oh, I'm smart. So that means I'm better than you, and I can diss on you. That's crap, right? It's
Right.
That's the wrong attitude to take. So you really need to have compassion for other people, especially those who are even treating you poorly, right? They're going to bag on you because you have a belief that they don't, or you don't believe what they believe. So they treat you as the enemy. Be kind to them, and don't, telling them how dumb they are.
Hard.
Being that they're sheep or whatever.
Right.
It's not going to help, and puts a barrier. So, and I think that. Again, here's my views, and I always put this disclaimer on here. This is how I see things, right? It's like there's nothing I'm going to say, and I'm always cautious, right? And this is kind of what I think is a part of the problem, is that everybody says things and they state it as fact. That means that anybody disagrees is wrong, right? So that suddenly anybody that doesn't see things the way I is wrong. I just don't buy that. And again, I accept that I'm probably wrong, but this is the best. I'm comfortable accepting these things based on experience and with some evidence. But it does seem that we are not only more than our material selves, right? There's a huge amount of evidence that there's more to us than simply our daily lives. I mean, if you need any further evidence, go to find out. Go ask science why we dream.
Yes. Or why we seem to be able to know things before they happen.
Yeah, well, they can come up with all kinds of gobbledygook excuses about that, and it's good evidence. I'm not dismissing that evidence or even diminishing it. But what I'm saying is, specifically, there are a few things they can't touch on, right? Which is ask them why we dream, but we don't have a freaking clue, like most things, and that's one that they can't give you a lot of gobbledygook. The gobbledygook is pretty thin to get anywhere. They have to admit we don't have any idea why even we need sleep. But we do. We'll die without it, right? And sleep is so.
They have no idea what consciousness is.
There's no evolutionary benefit to sleep. It puts you in a vulnerable position for a third of the day. It's preposterous that the idea that there is some evolutionary benefit to it. So, so once you can get to the idea that, that there's more to it, and that. The very fact that the idea is poo-pooed and people want to diminish you and belittle you for even looking into ideas of spirituality should be a big red flag that there's something there they don't want you to find, right? So when there's a keep out sign on anything, whether that's an idea, an ideology, a plant, or anything, if there's a keep out sign there, that's a good reason for it, and they're not looking out for your best interest. I'll tell you that from the outset, is that if you can accept the idea that people are in charge, have gone through a lot of effort to build an entire society. Again, it only takes about 3 generations to once everybody adjusts and acclimates to that, everybody repeats it thereafter. And this has been, I gotta say, proven, but we can demonstrate this over and over again with behaviorally with humans and animals, that it only takes about 3 generations. Once the first generation is dead and the other generations learn the behavior, everybody adopts the behavior as though it's normal, even though it doesn't make any sense. So there's all kinds of rituals and routines and things that don't make any sense, and are they're useless, but you do them because you've always done them, and it's just the way. So we can demonstrate this. How about that? That we can demonstrate that these people are not looking out for your best interest. There's a demonstrable proof that almost everything that you encounter in your daily life is in some way misdescribed at best. They're simply not going to tell you the pure truth about it. So you're kind of on your own there, and discernment is key because again, everybody's going to tell you if you can't trust what you get on the internet. Well, CNN's on the internet,
Yeah.
MSNBC's, Oxford's online, so you can't make that blanket statement.
How
But
about let's just make the blanket statement of not trusting anything implicitly.
there you go. I mean, that's the thing is don't
There we go.
take anything at face value. I mean, I would encourage anybody that's listening to us right now, don't take what I have to say for it.
Yeah.
I would feel horrible. I would just be
Yeah.
like, oh, I would facepalm. Really, don't take my word for it, right? I have reasons for the way that I approach things, and most of it's based on evidence and experience or certain pattern recognition or whatever. But I accept that I'm probably wrong because the data is short, right? So there's a
Right.
starvation of data, and so I have to accept that. But to the idea that you're bringing up, yes, is the people that I have seen that are the happiest and best adjusted, and the people that I want to emulate, and there are very few of them. I'll have to say that admittedly that there are very few people that I've known firsthand in my life that I really wanted to emulate, but that I was drawn to, and those people had these things in common, right? That they were people of integrity. So when they said they were going to do something, or when they talked to me, I knew that even if mistaken, they were at least sincerely mistaken.
Yeah.
They believed what they were saying, even if mistaken. But that they had other people's best interests at heart. That they lived a life that implicitly understood that they were part of something much bigger than themselves,
Yes.
and that they were not the central character in the movie. That they were born into something that started before them, and that they would perish, and it would go on without them, and that their desire was to make a difference and make it more positive during their time here. And I think that is hugely important. And everyone that I've seen that has made themselves a central character in the movie of their life is miserable.
Yeah.
And maladjusted, and that goes from the lowest to the highest, and probably more true on the higher up you go, the more likely those people are to be psychopaths, because the only reason you get power is to take it from somebody else. And so the more power you have, the more willing you have become to harm other people to get it for yourself. That's just the
True
way
that.
it is. And so that means implicitly that the people at the top have done really horrible things to get and keep that power because they were willing to do it. So that really what we have is each other, and that relationships are the most key important thing that we have, and learning to me, I would say learning to understand what love is. That's a really complex. We could,
We
pick
do
up
a whole
and
show just on
start
that.
2 hours more on that. Right?
Right.
Is what does that look like? Because it really is an ineffable thing,
Mm.
and it's not material. And so I'll come back to that. Is that the very fact that you're being societally strongly discouraged and punished for trying to look through the doors of reality into something that might be bigger than yourself or might be woo, that's so strongly discouraged that it should be an invitation to take a look into it. It certainly deserves some consideration and investigation at the minimum. And that when you develop relationships with people, to me, if you accept the idea that the consciousness is separate from the body, or an integral part of it, but it is a different thing. It's not that we're not really a machine, that there's a hardware, software sort of component.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of evidence of that, and without getting too far into that, there's a lot of ancillary and empirical evidence that there's something going on there. That if you accept that idea, and if you even entertain the idea that consciousness can continue on after the physical death, then the only things you can take with you are who you are and your relationships. That's it. Nothing material is going to follow you. And so the only things worth investing in that have any import at all and any lasting benefit are who you are and your relationships. And those are cannot be mutually exclusive. You must engage with other people at the risk of that you're going to be hurt. I mean, love. I heard it said, and I disagreed with it at first, and now I understand it better. Is that love is a debt, and when it comes time to pay, you pay in grief.
Mm.
And
Absolutely true.
It's a hard one. It's a hard one to really absorb, but there's some truth in that. But by investing in it and it's worth it, right?
Yeah.
It's really my experience is it's really worth it, and that the better. It's hard to moralize it and say we become better people. We become bigger people, then we can, in a way, become larger than life itself if we extend our influence beyond the material things, beyond the collection of stuff that we have or how we compare ourselves to others. Those comparisons are pretty much meaningless. Even comparisons of spiritual growth. Some people jump in with both feet and take to it like a mean dog, and other people can spend 40 years in yoga or church and become worse for it. Uh,
Yeah.
so, I would say going to church wouldn't make you a spiritual person any more than sitting in
No.
a garage would make you a car. Um, it's
True.
not that's not the thing, right? So I would say with any belief system, if you think your belief system is a positive benefit, if it doesn't change you, it's worthless. So
Amen.
whatever your belief system of any kind, if it doesn't affect positive and radical change in you over time, and if it's not costly to you, and if it's not difficult, then it is worthless. Um, so there is no easy fix. There's no magic wand, and everything of value has intrinsic cost to it. So if it's worth having, it's worth fighting for. And if it's worth having and attaining, it's going to be costly. It's going to be painful. And that I found that true with everything so far. These are just my experiences, but they seem to be fairly axiomatic that I have found very few exceptions, and anything really worth having is costly, and that if you get it, anything that's given too easily is not appreciated and is easily taken away.
Yes. That's a truth I was taught very early by my father, who liked to say, if it's easy, if you're doing the easy thing, you're probably doing the wrong thing.
Hmm.
And that is a perfect example of why. And I like you bring it back to, even with, we're using the words like belief and spirituality and these things, but bringing it back to, besides the fact that if it's not costly and if it's not changing you, then it's probably not worth it. It's also true that if it's not something that you're able to experience directly, it's probably not worth it as well, right? If it's just
Yeah,
something that you're just like able to kind of
sure.
intellectualize and say like, yeah, that sounds like a good belief, then that's
Yes.
probably not very effective. But if it's something that you can like kind of start to know and understand, then
Well,
that's where the money's at.
and I think that is hugely important. And I again, kind of, you can't see me now, but I'll bow to you on that one. Yes, and that's the very exactly the namaste. It's like that's the to me a key aspect again of the difference between knowledge and understanding is that knowing a belief system doesn't change you. And I find so many people, whether it's in religion or any kind, that they think that the more they know, the gnosis, right? It's going to get them
Right.
there. It's like that's not going to do it for you. In fact, all that's going to do is then make you compare yourself to others that you think you know more, and that is not growth, right? It's
No.
just knowledge.
It's an
Uh,
ego thing, right? You're like,
It's
I
an
know
ego.
more. I've studied this. I've read all these books and I can quote them back to you. And it's like, okay, but does it affect you? Have you changed? And do you really understand it intrinsically?
Sure. And then if anybody
You
can,
practice it.
and invariably they can, because I found that no religion or belief system contains all the truth. And so when
Right.
somebody can poke holes in it at some point, then you're faced with a choice of either ignoring empirical and ignoring evidence and not following truth in order
Right.
to hang on to your belief system, or you're going to have to let go of that belief system to follow the truth. And again, most people are unable to do that. If it's a gnosis, if it's a knowledge based belief system, then they're not going to go any further, right? It must be, as you said, experience. To me, that I go to understanding, right? So you can't just know it; you have to understand it, and to understand it, you must experience it, and firsthand. You must go through that process. And as you said, if it's easy, then it's probably not right. Well, I'll say that
Right.
things get easier. Right. So like
True.
when I very first began really doing self growth, right, in my around 30 years old, the idea of being transparent was terrifying to me because I had an accurate, it wasn't in any way disingenuous, but like my bio was, I can do it in 30 seconds and it was really compelling. It was accurate. But it wasn't, again, things can be accurate and not necessarily true.
Yeah.
All right. And so, and the idea of in the moment, especially in relational situations, not trying to put your best foot forward and not trying to put a good face on something or trying to achieve that approval, but to be honest. right, with yourself and with the other person about what's going on inside,
Yeah.
was terrifying. And the
Yeah.
first couple of times that I was faced with a decision to do it or not do it, I thought I was literally going to be sick. It was so stressful. And what happened was that thankfully the first, I don't know, dozen times or so, the outcome was not only not as scary as I thought, but it was always not only positive, but immensely positive, that people were stunned by that you were clearly, just I'm going to tell you the truth now, and they could see it was having an effect on you as well, and so it created again a bonding through trauma moment perhaps.
Yeah.
But the outcome was so positive, and so I was able to go through the first 5 years or so of believing that again there's a belief thing, believing that it was always the outcome was always good, and then it's not always good.
No.
People will treat you badly because people are bad.
They see a sort of place to attack, but that
Yes.
vulnerability is actually like a superpower, like you're saying, that
Sure.
can cause people to have moments of deep understanding and epiphany and bonding and
Right.
yeah.
So, but if you show that transparency, some people will think that that's an
Weakness.
opportunity for an advantage, right? So
Yeah.
weakness, and so they're going to use it for an advantage,
Right.
and try to use it against you, and that's painful. But again, you have to then make the
That's what
decision
makes
of
it vulnerability, right? I mean, it
vulnerability,
wouldn't
right?
be vulnerability if there wasn't this possibility of kind of piercing attack.
Sure. But like any sort of muscle memory, right? It's like anything. Once you do it over time, it becomes easier and easier to a point now, some 20 plus years later that I can't even imagine the thought process of not being completely genuine, right? Like
Yeah.
there's no circumstance in which I wouldn't be genuine. There are times that I have to stop and go, how would this person receive this? And how can I put it in a way that they're going to best receive this, right? Because I want to speak truth in love.
Yeah.
That's kind of my guideline there, right? So I want to be honest with them, but I don't want to do it in a way that is intentionally hurtful, or even if it's blunt and truthful. If I know that it's going to hurt them and it's
Yeah.
not going to be helpful, if they're just going to get defensive, it's going to hurt them. That's not helpful, right? It's not I don't want to enable people or coddle them what's necessary. Sometimes truth is painful, but that's what makes comedy funny. Truth and pain and comedy are like neighbors, right? They
Yeah.
barbecue together, their kids go to school together, right?
Yeah.
That's what as McLuhan would often say, that every good comedian, all good comedy is a grievance, right? It's somebody's expressing a grievance, and we laugh because it's release of tension. It builds tension, and we know the
Yeah.
tension, and
Uncomfortable.
yeah, it relieves it, and laughter is healing. So yeah, but yeah, these are the to me the biggest aspects of all of this is the idea that we're part of, we belong to something bigger than ourselves, and we belong here. And I think to the point, and this, you mentioned this idea, and this is really one I rarely get to, but because people I think aren't able to receive it. But this idea that what can we do to fight back, right? And
Yeah.
so again, people want to take this aggressive stance and
Mhm.
aggression and violence. But here's my take on it, right? Is that we often talk about what they're trying to put over us is an illusory artificial world to
Yeah.
replace the natural world. And
Yeah.
again, you've heard it said there's no lie in nature, and that we can follow these natural law and that sort of stuff. And I think there's a definitely truth in that, and that what I see in societal growth, especially the last 200 years, and I can't trust anything beyond about 250 years. I think it's been edited such that
Yeah.
much of it is replaced and again misrepresented. But insofar as we can do that, what it seems is that we have been intentionally separated from the natural world. That we don't grow our own food, right? We don't look at the sky. The artificial light has lit up the night sky. In fact, everything about modern culture takes us as far away from nature as we can. People go like, "Ooh, my feet touch the ground. Ooh, icky,
Yeah.
dirty. Oh, animals, gross."
And including this idea we talked on about earlier about disconnecting us from our own senses and our own understandings.
Exactly. So that we accept, again, that we're accepting by proxy somebody else telling us what is true and what is not. Right. So
Yeah.
I don't sense any emotion. Yeah, but that's just don't believe that. Really, we're spinning. We're moving at an aggregate
Hundreds
total
of
on
thousands.
on five axis, 1.567 million miles an hour, which is preposterous,
It's
right?
crazy.
With no evidence of it whatsoever. So,
Yeah.
but believe that, right? I don't see any curvature. It looks flat to me. Well, it goes over the horizon. See that? Okay, what? Yeah, but there's such a thing as called a refraction limit, and the angular size resolution that you can't. Once you learn optics, you go, it's nonsense. Again, they've hijacked the idea of perspective and said, well, it's it's getting smaller, so it's going over the curve. It's hogwash. So these ideas that again that we're told to let go of our own senses, to not trust our own senses, that we have almost everybody experiences senses of, like, I just knew somebody was going to call. I was thinking about them and they called. Oh, that's so
Right.
weird. But then we
Yeah.
call, oh, that's foo-foo, right? That's woo. Don't go there because people are going to think you're crazy.
Yeah.
And so I had, and this is, I know, things you wanted to talk to me about perhaps another time. You wanted to ask me about some of my early experiences with the sort of unseen world, and
Yeah.
I had very early experiences with it. I learned very quickly, don't talk about it because it makes
Right.
people uncomfortable and they're going to tell you
Yeah.
they're crazy. And so
Weirdly uncomfortable.
yeah, so yeah, scared, actually. They
Yeah.
become frightened of it, especially when you're accurate. That's the worst
Right.
thing. It's better if you're just nuts. If you're actually accurate, and really reading their mail, they get really, really uncomfortable. So I've had to learn very, very early on. Again, you're not gonna get the approval if you do that. So do something else. And so I think, I mean, I see all sorts of evidence that little kids, and they all believe in magic until they're told not to. Right. Um, it's just a natural instinct that we have. We know that there's something bigger out there, and there's something that connects all of us, and yet we get beaten out of us until literally they can't see it anymore. Right. And
Right.
that's a function of the limbic system. We really literally experience the world based on the data gets changed and the incoming, our incoming senses based on what we already believe. And after a while, it becomes so concrete that you literally experience it in a way that complies with your belief system rather than what you actually
Instead of,
experience. Yeah,
yeah.
and that is crazy and scary. So yeah, these things are to me the biggest aspects of, and if you are brave enough to accept that you don't know anything, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the some of the ways I describe it is, if you were spent all your life at the Magic Mountain ride at Space Mountain at Disneyland, and you believe you're going, car through space and all that sort of stuff, and then one day, just for a moment, you sort of looked over to the side and you saw a light come on, and mechanics and workmen there, and you saw the structure, and you go, "Holy shit! It's an illusion. It's a trick." Okay, you're in a theater the whole time and you don't realize there's anything outside the theater. Once you get a sense of looking backstage just for a moment, and you try to tell people, they're like, "You're nuts, right? Don't talk nuts. You're crazy. Look, we're in space." And so, and then they go, "Yeah, okay. So explain how it works." I don't know any of the mechanisms. I just know for sure that I saw tracks and I saw machines, and it's not what you think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, if you can't come up with a perfect model, right? If you don't have
Perfect. And prove it
yeah,
right
and prove
now.
it. Yeah, say, but we know it's a proven fact, and so they bully you out of it, right? And so peer pressure works. So if you can get through the fear and accept that if you begin digging, there is going to be pushback, and there's going to be hard pushback, and from people who have absolutely good motives. They want to protect you. People who care about you genuinely want you to not lose things, and they don't want you to be crazy. They don't want you to not see things the way they do, because you're leaving them. And so there's separation anxiety. There's all sorts of good motives
Yeah.
against from good people, but you're going to have to face that the first steps of the journey are really scary. And then eventually, though, it is true that deep calls unto deep, and that you are going to eventually find people that you resonate with and who are on the same journey as you're on. This is why we're talking now, right? So we ignored entirely the list of things that we were going to talk about, and we just talked because
That's true.
we're people who are kind of on the same journey, right? And so we're all going toward the same place from a different direction, and that's what I find the beautiful thing about it, is the relationships, right? So that we can find people that we resonate with, and that we have. We're all looking for the commonalities, that we're looking for truth, right? And we're willing to accept that we don't know what it is. Again, I would avoid anybody that speaks to you in absolutes.
Run the other
I'm going to tell
way.
you they're wrong, right?
Yeah.
Whether they're either frauds or fools. And again, if I'm saying that as an absolute, well, I mean, take it for what it is. But I'm saying my experience is that pretty much anybody who's 100% on anything, it simply can't be proven. And there's a measure of faith. There's a measure of belief. It's not proven. I just say SCP Hawk, all right, just take this for what it's worth, is that there's enough evidence from I find that the further you can go back, the the closer they were, right? And so they've turned the narrative upside down to say that those people were cretins and cavemen and knuckle draggers, and they were idiots and superstitious, and they didn't know anything. And they came up with these dumb ideas of God to explain things that they couldn't understand, and they're superstitious and blah, blah. Now we really know. Turn that narrative on its head. All the evidence strongly suggests that they were far more advanced in every way, by orders of magnitude than we are now.
Especially even if you just look at their architecture.
Yeah, just take a look at go look at the pyramids and really look into what that is, and the fact that we cannot today duplicate it.
Right.
With all the modern technology that we have and all the understanding, we couldn't today do that. And then you realize, put that together with the fact that means that since they're holding to a narrative and telling you that you're a crazy conspiracy theorist, a nut job, if you don't accept that it was built in 40 years by 1 million plus Egyptian slaves to be a tomb for a guy while he was still alive, and that they're going to hold to that and tell you you're nuts if you don't go with that, you have to really look at that critically and say, are they just wrong and stubborn, or is somebody lying? And both is probably the answer, but somebody is lying. Right. The level of pushback, again, I've said this, that the level of hostility that you get for suggesting or questioning a thing is usually directly proportional to the, or at least inversely proportional to its veracity, right? So if the narrative, the falser a narrative is, the bigger the pushback you're going to get when you question it. The tighter they're going to, the more they're going to freak out, right? So if you go, hey, maybe there's Bigfoot, people, I'll put you on TV, right? You go, right. Hey, maybe powerful, crazy Luciferian pedophiles rule our country.
Right. This person's nuts. Get him out of here.
Yeah. Reptiles rule the world. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, there's lots of ancient evidence of, weird stuff. So, I mean, again, so the more they tell you it's crazy, the more the more possibility is that they're trying to hide something, because otherwise it wouldn't be crazy. And I'll go back to this, that truth never, truth would never push away or be afraid of investigation.
Yes.
Right. It would welcome it. So
curiosity is welcomed.
Yes, exactly. So because all it would do is confirm, right, what is already proven. And so, you're just never gonna, anything that's true is not going to get pushback. But whenever you start getting really hard pushback, that's a place you may want to look at. And the crazier it seems, the bigger the probability that there might be something there, because you've been conditioned to think that it's crazy. I mean, otherwise, like the idea of like, again, well, I get upset too many people because people it's a really polarizing thing for a reason. But you go, like flat Earth or whatever, you go, hey, wow, looks kind of flat and motionless to me, and I don't know. Then people, oh, that's the craziest, you're crazy. Wow, what, really? It looks that way. I mean, and that's the first thing you see. This is back to the idea of making you think that you're smart. So like the idea with little kids, the first thing they tell you is you live on a spinning ball. And what they tell you is the ancients were so dumb that they thought it was flat. So now you're really smart because you know better. So now you think, now you're on the inside secret. You're smart because you ignore your senses and accept what somebody else says. That makes you smart. And they play on that the whole time by making you, rewarding your ability to parrot and accept what they tell you. And so I'd say always be cautious of that. But look for things outside yourself. Look for good. Oh, this is the thing I want to say, right? Is they're creating this artificial construct of a world and expecting us to go along with it. And here's the thing I would say to fight back is the more in tune that you can become with yourself and with the universe, I'll put it that way, you'll notice that over time, you'll feel it, that you're in the right place at the right time. There's a confidence that comes with it. You're no longer afraid of anything, and because you just know, right? And you just often will just get this most glorious sense that you are just perfectly in the right place at the right time. And the more that happens, that's what I think screws up their algorithm, right? Because they're artificially, they're put you in Sim City. Right. And so it's an artificial construct. And so they've controlled all the information. And if you respond to the information that they give you, you're going to respond in a predictable way. It's when you don't listen to them and you begin to pay attention to your senses, including that other sense,
Yeah.
and behave in that way. That's what screws them up. So if you
Yes.
want to fight back, the more in tune you can become with what they're trying to keep from you, which is an understanding of who you are and that you have power, and that you're not a powerless, insignificant speck on a speck on a speck, that you are loved and accepted. I'll just throw that out there, that you are loved and accepted, even if you don't know it.
Yes.
And if you can even accept yourself, that's a tall order, especially even for me, right?
But it's the
Been dealing with
best
it for a
way
long
that you can
time.
change the world.
You can't really love anybody else until you love yourself. You really can't.
Really true.
I mean, and I accept that I'm screwed up. I
Yeah.
know I'm broken and messed
Not
up in
perfect.
so many ways. But I mean, so is my wife, and I accept her for that, right? It doesn't make me love her any less. I know where she's screwed up, and so I'm sensitive to those places. I don't want to hurt her, right? So when you can kind of come to a place of that and realizing that everybody is starving for love and affection,
Starving
to death. And so just like a starving dog, they're not a bad dog, but if they're starving on the street and they've been beat all their lives, you get near them, they're going to want to bite you, and then you think, oh God, dogs are bad, they're scary. They're not, right? They're just hungry. The dogs are the most beautiful. I keep saying, be more dog, right? They're way more better, beautiful souls than most people these days. Because they just want to love, and they just want to please you. So but just like a starving, beat down dog, people are going to behave that way, and so they're starving for love and affection. And if you can get it through your head that that's what they really want and treat them with love and affection, they respond in a beautiful I mean, most people. There's some people that they can't, and you can't fix anybody. It's not your job. But if you can give them what they're starving
them, though.
yeah, you can, and you can offer it, and be genuine about it, right? And so the closer you can get to that epiphany of love and what it is, and be able to share it with others and be a conduit for it, and not be so starving for it that you're going to try to take it from other people, that you're willing to give it away because there's more out there, right? It's a flowing river. So I would often describe it as the difference between a river and a reservoir, right? So if it's a reservoir, you try to hold it up, but it's going to get, it gets stagnant, right? It doesn't flow. You got to let that thing flow through you, right? And move on. And it's always fresh, and it creates life. These are the real places of beauty for me, is to see people get fed, and the unexpected place where you're kind to people who are unkind to you, and they don't know why. Again, there's always going to be people that abuse it, and they mistake kindness for weakness, and it hurts, and it sucks, especially when it's somebody who has power over you, right? Your boss, or the corporations, or the city, or the state, or the government. I mean, they're always trying to take your power, and you have to weave your way through it. But when you're filled with something that's bigger, and you have something they can't take from you, there's nothing they can take from you, right? They just can't. And so I have no need to rail against the machine, or to go, blow up buildings, right? Or do any of these stuff that people think would be helpful, because you're giving them what they want in terms of, it's a violent approach, then they know how to answer violence.
Right.
What they don't know is how to respond to love, and to be an authentic human being. That's what screws up their system real bad. And I think that's what they're terrified of, is people would wake up and go, hey, wait a minute, we're all, everything is interconnected, and if I harm you, I'm harming me. And wait, that's not right. And so once you realize that everything is interconnected, and that you are part of everything, and it's all just meant to be, and if the closer you can get to being in harmony with the natural vibrations of things, the more you're going to screw them up. And if that gives you a sense of accomplishment, or that you're doing something to sabotage their machine, good. But you'll come to a place where, sort of like me, you'll understand that one of the most beautiful screwed up things I ever heard my creator say to me is that, asking me if somebody hurt me, and I was like, they did. And he's like, you can take your revenge upon them by loving those that they would not. And it was the most beautiful screwed up thing I ever heard, because there's no revenge in it, right? It's all about love, and there's no harm to anyone. It's like, that's the they say the best revenge is living well. Well, it sort of is. There's no thought of harm or revenge. It's you're simply exceeding their expectations. I don't know how to put it. So that was just a beautiful moment for me to realize that the way to
get back at them, if you will, is to love those that they wouldn't. And so I find, again, the people the most receptive to it are those who are the most starved for it. So the people that we're taught to hate and to think and be afraid of, the homeless people and the poor people, we're taught that having money makes you good, which is, I mean, it's so upside down. The poverty is no character flaw. I mean, sometimes poor decisions will put you in poverty, but simply not having means doesn't make you a bad person, right? There's no morality there. But we're taught that they must be bad people because they don't have any money, and so we're going to be afraid of them, and they're going to try to take my stuff because I'd take somebody else's stuff. It's all a lie. And when you can give those people the food that they need, which is more than the physical food, but the affection and the dignity that people need, it's been stripped of them, and to watch them respond, nothing will feed your soul more, I think. I mean, that's my experience, is that there's nothing more satisfying than seeing a hungry soul come alive by being fed unexpectedly in a place that they didn't see it, right? So anyway, that would be my encouragement to people, is to I've gotten pushback before when I say, just be kind to people. Some people don't deserve being kind to. I'm like, then you're no better than them, really. I mean, I'm not beating anybody up. I'm just going, but you're playing their game, and
Right.
and if that you can't win their game, I promise. They have so much more experience and understanding and resources, and they know the way that you're trying to play checkers and they're playing 3D chess. You can't win that game. But when you get out and you stop playing their game, right, then that's what they can't abide, right? Is because they're trying to steal your soul. I mean, your connection to this whole place. They're trying to steal it and disconnect you. And if you can reconnect, that's where your power is.
Absolutely. Amen. I love it. So, fellow travelers of the path, it is a beautiful thing. This has been your analog, concentric, electric dose of wisdom, according to the Great Baldini. Baldini, thank you so much for being here with me today and for sharing such a beautiful, profound message.
It's been a delight, and I'd love to do it again.
Absolutely. We're going to do it again.
Cool.
So sometimes an insider goes rogue, and we are all the better for it. Take heed and follow the few instead of the masses in this time of darkness and deceit, and help blaze a trail out of this murky mess. Go rogue and find the pieces we left so long ago. Bring them back and shout to the zombies about the truth that you found, and never stop, because the value is in the sharing of seeds that will grow into the brambles that will tear down the castle walls, trebuchets or not. And until the day you launch your first attack on that empire, travel well, aim for balance, and always look inside first. Mwah.
It's a one-on-one lesson, so do your homework. Make your dome hurt while up on earth. My bones are blessed from holy dirt. Vibes manifested to words that told me search for verbs and adjectives to describe birth. Worth more than one can speak, while the tongue feeds a weak, a sour taste in your mouth, bittersweet. Words can also kill you when you sleep. Mind condition, low frequencies while the subconscious mind listens. I can tell a vision filled with lies, disguised as truth, and spread it like the word to the youth. Watch the tube. A place where the God gets booed is sorcery. To recreate a God forgery does more than meets the eye. Not too many know. Just hear me flow like the eye of Horus Penio. Yeah, not ready to leave until we believe we're free to go. You hear me? Right.
Sculpted from the ether, the material will eat ya. Stuck on this plane, lanes use jet fuel to greet ya. The dimensional three ain't beating me on top of the fourth. Didn't climb Jacob's ladder to squab with a sword. Forged with ink drizzle, branched out. Try quiet your lamps now. Ascension past the matter, let they slam out they damn mouths. We ain't on land now, but they over understand. Sacrificing wisdom, hoarding dumber kosher wicked hands. Putting faith in worthless worship of the mortals. Artificial portals, mass ingestion of the black goo. Bioengineered morsels, conversing with machine elves. Bypassing maggots, they stuck on Android screens now. I'm scrolling emerald tablets. Moloch living lavish, off the back to the savage. Them clasp hands at the Sabbath, smack